Hello guys, welcome back to my channel and enjoy this fanfic part 1. Now let's start the fanfic. From an emptiness, simultaneously endless in its expanse and yet feeling like a mere blink in time, the being became conscious of itself. Its eyes gradually forced themselves open. An impressively painful headache made every thought a laborious and uncomfortable process. With an air of uncertainty and confusion, it began to look around and take in its surroundings. The most obvious detail made itself known to the being immediately, and likely would have even if it hadn't opened its eyes. The floor was covered in a liquid of some sort. The best guess is that this was probably water, though there was the off chance it may have been something less pleasant. The being decided to not make its headache worse, chasing that paranoid thought any further. It would only serve to make an already bad situation oh so much worse. The next immediate detail was that there was a red gate of some sort, directly in front of where the creature's face rested. The gate was closed, and seemed to be sealed, though had no obvious details to hint at whether it was locked or not, at least from this side. Peering through the gate, a long, dimly lit hallway could be seen. The hallway was possibly a never-ending series of corridors, but that was just an assumption based on what could be seen. Glancing behind itself showed a gradual fade to a blackness. It seemed endless at first glance, but the outlines of a wall could just barely be seen in the inky darkness. Moving its gaze in any other direction saw more walls, sterile, blank walls. Judging by everything that could be seen, the creature seemed to be in some sort of cage. Eventually, the thought of, "Where am I?" managed to enter its mind after a bit of effort. Its mind tried branching out and it was immediately met with more of the pain from its earlier headache, reminding the creature that, yes, its head was still very much in pain. The next thought that stumbled into the creature's mind was, "Who am I?" It lifted its head and looked down into the water. Crimson, slitted eyes looked back at itself. The thought that followed was a cautiously curious, "What am I?" After some time had passed, it moved its head to try and look upon itself. Its eyes were met with red-orange fur that covered an animalistic, yet semi-humanoid body. There was a cluster of 9 flowing tails that had been laying as limp the rest of its body, though they were now starting to stir and become more animated as the rest of the body came under the being's conscious control. After taking the details of itself into consideration, it made the assertion that it was something canid, a fox maybe. It could have passed for a wolf, though looking closer into the reflection established that it was indeed a fox of some kind. Its crimson eyes blinked as they observed, taking in the details of its visage. It was definitely more fox-like in its appearance. A long, slender snout, slender being relative, elongated canid ears, black canid lips and a black pattern of fur covering around its eyes and leading into its ears. It noted, however, that it wasn't specifically an animal, neither was it quite humanoid enough to sway anywhere in that direction either. It was an uncanny mix of both, at least as far as its body was concerned. Its head though, that was undeniably animal in its features. Okay, I'm some sort of fox thing. A semi-humanoid fox thing, with 9 tails. I'm trapped in some sort of cage, there's water covering the floor, and there's an endless hallway just outside the cage. The fox thought to itself as it proceeded to lift itself up off the ground and slowly move over to take a seat at the gate. That brings up a lot more questions than it answers, it sighed to itself, but at least I have a better idea of what I am and where I am, sort of. After staring at the gate for a short amount of time, the fox worked up the courage and cautiously lifted its oddly humanoid hand towards the gate. It momentarily stopped to take in the details of its hand. I was expecting paws, but I won't complain about having opposable thumbs. It then gingerly pushed on the gate with one outstretched finger, then motioning to push with its palm. It sighed to itself when, naturally, the gate didn't budge even by the tiniest margin, though the fox quickly changed its attitude when it realized that at least the gate hadn't been laced with some sort of sinister trap. Without hesitation, the fox then slammed into the gate full force using its shoulder as the primary impact source. The fox let out an audible cry of pain afterwards when, as the fox should have expected, the gate again refused to budge and was made of a very unforgiving material that absorbed very little of the impact and left the fox to slump down before the gate, clutching its now understandably sore shoulder. Arg! That was stupid. Why did I do that? Why did I think that was a good idea? The fox angrily berated itself, but soon stopped as it realized that it actually hadn't thought that through at all. Okay then, mental note, think before doing something like that again, should have been obvious in hindsight, but, whatever, on to more pressing concerns. The fox was quick to recover, soon wandering about the cramped confines of its cage, looking for any semblance of an exit. There was an audible sigh once the obvious reality of the situation set in. This was a prison. Of course there isn't going to be any way out of here besides the main gate. The gate that's locked, because this is a prison, right? The fox huffed and plopped down onto the ground in frustration. The exceptionally painful headache decided to remind the fox that it was still there, causing the fox to groan and now clutch at its head. Alright, so, I'm in a cage, I'm a nine-tailed fox, I have a raging headache, and I have no conceivable means of simply leaving this dungeon at the moment. The fox assessed its situation a little bit further, soon probing into its mind to see if it could find anything useful. Before the headache chased away this mental exploration, the fox managed to discover that it had access to a decent selection of knowledge and information, but nothing that would be of much use in the current situation. It rubbed at its temples tenderly, trying anything it could to remedy the intense headache, with limited results. The fox categorized and organized the knowledge it managed to pull out, taking note that the headaches seemed to grow stronger whenever it tried to pull anything from its memories. A fresh intensity of the headache reiterated this to the fox when it tried rooting around in the foggy cloud of its mind again, and it gritted its teeth in response to the pain. RRRGH, damn it, fine, fine. I get it. Keep out of the memories, for now, he conceded, folding his arms and laying his head upon them. At any rate, I still haven't quite figured out what exactly I am, or who I am, for that matter. Come to think of it, a quick glance between the fox's legs to determine gender proved fruitless, as it had nothing to give itself any distinction either way. The fox furrowed its brow, but swiftly chastised itself after a line of thought and contemplation brought about another reprimand from its headache. Wait, why am I worried about that in the first place? Literally none of that line of thinking matters so long as I'm stuck here in this damned cage. Time passed by. The red-orange fox beast had proceeded to scour over each and every corner and wall of his prison, determined to find something, anything at all that could lead to his freedom from this cage, despite the fact that it had already thoroughly checked every nook and cranny that the cage had to offer and found nothing time and time again. Damn it. There has got to be something here, something I'm missing, the fox stated as he pursued his fruitless endeavors with a renewed vigor. A light bulb lit in the fox's mind, which it immediately whacked itself in the face with for how painfully obvious of an idea it was. The fox took in a breath, aimed its gaze out into the endless hallways, and then let out a bellowing shout. Hello? Is anyone out there? Hello? It yelled as loud as it could. The voice the fox emitted was fairly masculine, though one would be hard-pressed to think about that finer detail, given how deep and thunderous the sound of the voice was. Okay, additional information, I'm a male, and I must be monstrous if my voice is that deep and capable of such a high volume. Just how big am I? For that matter, how strong am I? Ah well, questions for later. He was silent and listened for a possible reply if anyone had been nearby to hear that. Given how loud he had managed to make his voice, the fox asserted that, surely, anyone within several miles would have heard that, especially given the acoustics of his prison and the hallways connected to it. That is, assuming this place has an entrance. He furrowed his brow and grew disheartened at the implications that popped into his mind. The fox shook his head and tried to dismiss the implications. This place had to have some sort of entrance, right? Otherwise, how else would he have gotten here? That was another thing that remained unanswered. How did he get in here? A fresh dose of pain from his headache quickly waved away that question nearly as quickly as it had cropped up. The fox's already monstrous quantity of frustration was steadily growing with each passing minute now, having next to nothing in the way of answers or possible avenues of escaping this prison. Eventually, the fox's frustration at the situation at hand reached a boiling point and he started to lash out. He thrashed about with his cluster of tails, each independently whipping and slamming at the floor, walls, gate, etc. At the same time, the fox dashed about in the confined space, bashing himself against the sides of his prison, rapidly jumping and clawing and slamming in vain at and into the three solid walls and gate. The significant lack of visible damage only increased his frustration and egged him on in his outburst. The fox was soon screaming in rage at the situation, this damned cage, his powerlessness to free himself, his lack of memory and confusion regarding who he was and where he was, the headache that was only growing progressively worse the more he thrashed about and raged against the inanimate surroundings. He was furious, but without anyone or anything to direct his fury at, so he simply continued directing the anger at the inanimate cage that held him. After an uncertain amount of time passed, the fox's rampage gradually died down. His anger and frustration had largely dissipated due to the onset of exhaustion. A sense of despair begun to take place of the anger. The pain that resulted from his body impacting into the walls and gate repeatedly had helped curb his rage by a significant margin. He slumped over and sprawled out onto the ground with an audible sigh. Light splashes went to either side from the liquid that, the fox noted, still coated the surface of the floor in this pseudo-dungeon. Once he'd calmed down enough, he considered that little detail. That seems a little odd, now that I think about it. If this is a prison, shouldn't there be something to allow for the water to drain to prevent flooding? The fox observed, taking mental note of that, adding another piece to this elaborate puzzle he found himself in. Come to think of it, how did the water get in here? There has to be some sort of entrance, or opening to the outside world, he said aloud to himself. A few moments passed, and he proceeded to take another deep breath before bellowing once again, "Hello? Is anyone out there? Answer me. Someone. Anyone. Release me." Many hours later, the fox was in a leisurely, prone position on the floor. He idly swished the tips of his many tails through the water around him while he rested his cheek in his palm lazily. He exhaled through his nostrils before mumbling to himself, "So, for the most part, my situation hasn't changed since I first woke up in here. That being said, my headaches have died down to a much more tolerable level, so at least I've got that going for me, which is nice." Out of boredom, he waved a free hand through the water and splashed some of the liquid at the red gate that still stood there, seemingly taunting the fox in his predicament. The fox gave the gate a glare and splashed more water at it. "Take that." He smirked triumphantly at the wet sheen that now coated part of 3 of the lower bars of the gate. His triumph was short-lived, however, as the red-orange fox remembered that this was still an inanimate object he was directing his anger at. His look of triumph quickly turned to a scowl and he laid his head onto the ground with an audible huff. Given that the fox literally had nothing else to do, he conceded to the gate and decided to let his eyes slowly shut. Before he realized it, sleep had taken him. Several hours, possibly days later, it was nearly impossible for him to keep track of time by any stretch of the imagination at this point, despite his best efforts, the fox woke from his slumber. The dreams that he could recall added considerably more confusion to the situation. These dreams largely consisted of odd sequences where the fox found himself in the form of a human child, in what he could only assume was some sort of town or small city. The inhabitants he encountered were unpleasant, to say the least. Either they'd avoid him like he was afflicted with some sort of disease, or they would berate him with all manner of thinly veiled insults and were generally disrespectful, to put it mildly. The fox mulled over the strange dreams, if he could classify them as dreams, given how oddly consistent and vivid they were. He'd spent a good portion of time deep in thought about the unusual dreams, but he eventually came to the decision to momentarily set the thoughts aside for later, in the off chance that he'd have more information about where he was and how he'd come to be here, in addition to the other obvious questions that still remained unanswered. As of right now, there was no feasible way for him to try and figure any of this out. He sighed and resigned to the situation yet again. The fox lay on the ground and dragged his claws over the poles that made up the gate, seeing if he could determine what material they were made from. It was possible that he could find a way to damage the gate, maybe try and wear down the gate little by little until he made an opening big enough to fit through. Not likely, given how much strength I put into that rampage. He made the motion to sigh, though it turned to more of a growl as his frustration grew again. He took a deep breath and shouted once more, "If anyone is out there, I demand you release me. You'd better let me out of here, or else I'll." He swiftly chastised himself. "Damn it, what am I thinking? Nobody is going to come if I threaten them." He then groaned and tried again, this time with a slightly more humble approach. "I don't know why I've been locked in here, but I would greatly appreciate it if you would release me, if anyone can hear me." The fox waited for a response, and when none came he felt himself growing frustrated and angry again. Angry at this cage, angry at not being able to remember how he'd gotten here, angry at not knowing his own damn name. Damn all of this, he thought, and then proceeded to descend into a fit of rage and thrashed about in his prison once more, screaming and shouting at the gate that still stood there, unscathed by any of his best efforts to break it down. "Let me out, let me out, release me, now, you can't keep me imprisoned in here like this. Let me out." The halls echoed with his screams of anger and despair, as well as the various sounds of his body impacting off the walls and the gate. As was the case with the last time, he eventually tired out, though this time he'd raged at his prison for much longer. He had no idea how long he'd been like that, screaming and raging at the gate and the featureless walls, though judging by how exhausted he was and how sore his body was, he decided it was fair to assume that it had been significantly longer than the last time. "Please, please, let me out." Days passed in similar fashion. The fox would wake up after a session of more of those strange dreams. He would search his prison for any sort of change that he could try and take advantage of, to no avail. Then he would shout and scream to try and see if anyone was near enough to hear him. The fox cycled between boredom and frustration, then anger and despair. The former led him to calling out in the off chance someone would hear him, the latter leading to him screaming and lashing out at the gate and walls, which lead to him suffering self-inflicted injuries. Afterward he would succumb to exhaustion and sleep, though he rarely ever fought sleep due to the fact that there was never anything else really to do aside from his normal schedule of screaming and vainly thrashing against his cage. The dreams never helped any either, the strange town and its inhabitants. He would encounter people he didn't know and yet seemed to recognize, though he couldn't put a name to them. He could recall speaking, though not with his own voice and not of his own conscious thought. It was like he was watching someone else live out their life, though who this person was, the fox had no idea, not even a clue. Things continued like this. Days melted into weeks, though after some time, the fox gave up with trying to keep track of time altogether and simply went along with his improvised schedule. The fox lay there panting, nursing his self-inflicted wounds and grumbling all manner of obscenities to himself after his latest frustration, desperation-induced rage fest. He'd been preoccupied with his injuries and his anger, so much so that he hadn't heard the footsteps that were slowly approaching the gate from the hallway. The blonde-haired boy had a subtle tremble as he stood there, looking up at the fox with that wide-eyed, fearful expression still on his face. The fox glanced about in the awkward silence that filled the room, desperately trying to think of something to say to break the silence and ease the situation. The boy was dressed in an old t-shirt and a ragged pair of pants, as well as a hoodie that was currently tied around his waist like a makeshift belt. The fox made further note that the boy had what looked like scratch marks on both of his cheeks that made a pattern resembling whiskers. As the boy's expression grew worse, the fox decided to take the initiative and speak first. He lightly cleared his throat before speaking softly, trying to keep his voice low in order to not frighten the boy any more than he already had. Despite his effort, his voice still seemed to come across in the usual booming fashion. "Hello there, child. Who, may I ask?" Before he could finish his sentence, the boy interrupted with, "Why you? That was you, this whole time." This caught the fox off guard, not sure what the child was implying by this. You have me at a disadvantage here." The child shook his head in denial, keeping his eyes trained on the fox with the same look of fear as of yet unchanged. No. You can't be real. This all has to be a bad dream." The boy pinched himself in an effort to force himself to wake, though this only caused him to yelp in pain and look back at the fox with a look that quickly degraded into terror as he realized he wasn't dreaming, or at the very least, he wasn't able to wake himself up. Seeing that the situation was teetering towards disaster, the fox tried again, this time lowering his voice as if he were whispering in a desperate attempt to lessen the boy's fear. "Child, please listen to me, I'm not going to hurt you," and again the fox never got to finish his sentence. The child was quickly backing away from the gate and refusing to break eye contact with the fox. "Not going to hurt me? You think I'm some kinda idiot? I know how these stories end. The kid gets close, too close, and the monster eats him. The second he lets his guard down he gets eaten. Not me. Nah. I'm not falling for your tricks and I'm sure as heck not gonna be your snack, you damn fox monster." It was at this point that the child had turned and made a break for it, running to the hallways at as fast a speed as he could manage. "Child, stop. Come back. Come back." The fox cried out in vain at the rapidly fading visage of the boy, cursing at himself for not adequately preparing for the off chance that his attempts at getting someone's attention had actually succeeded. He slammed his balled fist into the floor nearby, cursing aloud now with some colorful choices of vocabulary. Several paragraphs of expletives later, he spoke in sentences that weren't comprised entirely of swears. Damn it. Finally someone comes to investigate my calling out for help, and they just up and flee in terror at the sight of me. Of all the rotten luck, it had to be some dumb brat, didn't it? Aargh. The fox sat there brooding for quite a long time after that. Fantastic work, idiot. Spent all that damn time calling out for help, praying that someone would hear you, and lo and behold, someone finally responds. I sit there looking like an idiot, because it turns out I hadn't spent a lick of time preparing for how to handle the situation. Truly, impeccable strategy. What's next? Am I going to get free of this cage and run into a trap that puts me in another cage? Brilliant. All this time in this damn cage trying to find a way out, and not even so much as an idea for phase 2. He continued to berate himself for a good length of time, though he also made a point to have a legitimate plan for the next time he came in contact with someone. At the very least, he'd be prepared for his next encounter, whoever that may be. He decided that the biggest problem was his appearance, so he made it a point to try and take up a pose and posture that mitigated his intimidating visage as much as possible. He also made a point to try and avoid letting his anger and frustration seep into his voice. Well, it's not a perfect plan, but it's something. The fox shrugged his shoulders and went prone, nothing to do now but wait. Hopefully either the brat comes back, or someone else comes to investigate. He yawned and lightly stretched before rolling over onto his back and taking a brief nap. A day later, the fox was laying on his back, staring at the featureless ceiling and making a box shape with his fingers and thumbs held together, holding the shape in front of his face like an artist taking a reference. You know, this place wouldn't be so bad if it had a mural or something up there. Though, to be fair, literally anything would be an improvement for this detestable prison. He spoke aloud to himself, having figured that speaking would help stave off the threat of going insane from boredom and isolation. Unbeknownst to the fox, the boy had returned sometime over the past few hours and was watching the fox out of curiosity, though he made sure to keep his distance from the gate and not make any noise that would have alerted the fox to him being there. The child was confused as to why he'd wound up back in this place, wherever he was. It was the same place he had been the previous night, the place with the giant cage that held the huge orange fox in it. He was just as frightened by all of this as he was the previous night. This isn't a dream, is it? He thought to himself, silently watching the giant fox talk to himself and stare at the ceiling. He guessed that the fox was probably some sort of monster or demon, judging by the large piece of paper attached to the front of the gate with one of those old symbols painted onto it. In the stories he remembered, they'd use these kinds of things to imprison powerful evil spirits. But those were just stories, right? There's no way that this can be real. Maybe this is a nightmare that I just can't wake myself up from. Yeah, that has to be it. I just need to stay away from that monster until I wake up. As long as that dumb fox can't get me, I'll be safe and I'll wake up eventually. The boy gulped and tried his best to strengthen his resolve, despite everything in his mind telling him to make a run for it. In the worst-case scenario, he could flee out the hallway again like he did last time, but he was also kind of afraid of how creepy and intimidating the seemingly endless hallways were. I can at least get away from this guy if I have to, as long as the cage stays locked up, better than being trapped in a closed room with him, right? He concluded in his mind, keeping his eyes trained on the fox and watching for any sudden movements in case the big dumb fox tried anything sneaky. While the boy stood there watching the fox, his mind wandered to the events leading up to all this. Location: Konoha Market. Time: noon. Flashback. Naruto ooh, cried the voice of a very angry baker chasing the boy down the streets of the village. You really did it this time, you demon brat. He continued to shout, despite the boy easily leaving him in the dust once he took a few alleyway shortcuts and snuck through a crowd that was focused enough on a local sales pitch to pay him much mind. He was gone, there was no way the baker would find him now. Naruto grinned in satisfaction as he plopped down on a bench and reveled in his latest prank. The baker deserved it, he had no sympathy for a jerk like that guy. The baker had decided to hike up the prices again when Naruto tried to buy himself breakfast earlier that morning. Despite the boy's protests and arguing that the baker never did this when anyone else bought breakfast, the baker had remained steadfast and refused to negotiate. It wouldn't have been such a big deal, had the baker not decided to raise the price by so much that even one of those rich snobs from the wealthier districts couldn't afford to buy from the man's wares. That jerkface of a baker never noticed that Naruto had snuck in and replaced his sugar with salt, right before the baker was prepping his batch of sweets for the afternoon snack rush. It wasn't until the baker took a bite that he'd realized what happened, and he angrily wailed with his hands waving in the air in exaggerated fashion, "Ruined. All of it. Rui end." He was furious, though he only figured out that it had been the blonde because Naruto had started bursting out with laughter at the baker's response and making it painfully obvious that he was the culprit. Luckily, he was always faster than the victims of his pranks, well, most of the time. Naruto sat there on the bench, that satisfied grin still plastered on his face. Victim didn't feel like the right word. His shenanigans never came from a place of malice. He'd usually pranked people just to get their attention, but this time the baker needed to be taken down a peg. Heck, he already overcharges people for his crap to begin with, that much Ryo, for a tiny pastry. It's bad enough that he makes everything be super expensive when I'm there, but even when I leave he still makes his crap expensive. I mean, I'd be able to afford it at that price at least, but still. It's not like he makes anything all that special either. That pudgy bastard deserved it. He figured he was giving the baker his, just desserts. Naruto laughed at the clever pun that went through his mind, not noticing the angry visage of the baker rapidly closing in on him. He hadn't expected the baker to actually chase after him all this way. They usually gave up after he lost them for a few blocks. The blonde never saw him coming. Naruto lay in his bed later that evening, making a mental note to be much more careful the next time he pulled a prank on that pudgy baker. He'd been made to eat the entire batch of ruined treats that the baker prepared as punishment. That was the grossest thing I ever tasted in my life, he thought to himself and stuck out his tongue in disgust, remembering the atrociously salty taste of the sabotaged treats. The silver lining that Naruto could take from this was that that damned baker had none of the usual snacks he'd normally sold in the afternoons thanks to the successful prank. That, and the boy had gotten free food out of it, albeit nasty food, but food nonetheless. He chuckled to himself and triumphantly declared, "Joke's on him," before settling in under his bed sheets and slowly drifting off to sleep. That night, Naruto was woken by a loud screaming from a booming voice he couldn't recognize. He first thought it was just a nightmare, but then the voices continued to scream and shout. He quickly glanced about his room, fearing at first that someone had broken into his house. When the voice continued and with no one around for the voice to be coming from, at least that the boy could see, he cautiously laid back down in his bed, though he kept his eyes open and glanced about every few seconds to make sure nothing was sneaking up on him. After another round of angry screams echoed in his mind, he called out, Hello. Who's there?" After receiving no answer, he tried again to no avail. "Come out from wherever you are, I can hear you." Again, nobody answered and no one made their presence known. Despite this, the angry shouts echoed in his head, not loud enough to be uncomfortable, but, to the boy's dismay, loud enough to keep him awake. Hours passed with the boy tossing and turning, trying anything and everything to get the screaming out of his head. Luckily, the shouting eventually subsided, and the blonde eventually managed to get a tiny portion of sleep, but this did little to ease the exhaustion he felt the next day. The next day was misery personified. Naruto had been too tired to concoct any effective pranks that day, so he mostly stayed under the radar, much to the rest of the village's relief. He grumbled and groaned, struggling to keep his eyes open. "Man, I dunno how those big kids do it, pulling those full-nighters, or whatever they're called. This stinks," he managed to get out with a hefty yawn. Night couldn't come fast enough, but to his dismay, this night wound up being a repeat of the previous one. As Naruto lay there in bed, besieged by the constant yelling and shouting again in his head, he groaned and wrapped a pillow over his ears in a desperate attempt to block out the sound. The pillow had zero effect on the screaming, just like the last time. Shut up, shut up. Seriously, just shut up already. He growled at the disembodied voice that insisted on throwing a temper tantrum when he was trying to sleep. The worst part was that there was never anyone he could pin the voice to. It followed him when he decided one night to run off and find a quiet place to sleep away from his home out of desperation. Damn it, I'd love to punch whoever the hell that voice belongs to, he thought to himself in his sleep-deprived state. Eventually Naruto came up with the brilliant idea to find time to sleep before night time, so that at the very least, he could prevent the angry voice in his head from depriving him from sleep. The plan worked, for the most part, and the boy was able to get some semblance of sleep, even if it wasn't all that great and it cost him valuable hours of daylight. Still, it was better than being exhausted all the time. Well, it's dumb, but it works, he conceded. Weeks passed, and the plan was working well enough that he was able to function and occasionally pull off a prank or two, but he was still suffering from fatigue and lack of sleep. A disturbing detail he remembered vividly was that when he tried sleeping at night, he would occasionally find himself waking up in a dark hallway that seemed to go on forever. The floor was flooded almost up to his ankles, and he heard no small variety of strange noises coming from one end of the hallway. From what he could hear, it sounded like there was some kind of large animal in that direction, though he would occasionally hear that same voice that kept him up at night, albeit with less screaming and shouting. This strange place creeped him out to no end, and he usually just sat down in the hallway, glancing frantically in either direction to prevent anything from sneaking up on him. He would keep like this until he eventually woke up. As time progressed, Naruto found himself more frequently appearing in that creepy, flooded hallway, making him dread sleeping during the night. Naruto paid no mind throughout the following month, when the villagers started spreading rumors like, "That boy can't even sleep now, this is a bad omen, I heard that evil spirits keep him awake at night." And other such elaborate fabrications. He didn't care, they were always saying dumb things behind his back, or to his face. He never understood why the villagers were always angry at him. The only thing he could assume was that it was probably due to his love of pranks, or something. At any rate, he had more important things to worry about, such as what he was going to do for money, given how obnoxiously overpriced everything was for him specifically. As far as food was concerned, there was always ramen Ichiraku. In addition to being one of the only places to actually charge him the same price they asked of everyone else, they often gave him a free meal, and it was always a cheap, warm, tasty meal. The blonde checked his frog pouch wallet, fist pumping as he counted out more than enough ryo to buy ramen for the next couple of days at least, counting the free meals that the shop's owner would give him. Naruto didn't have enough for much else, but he'd be able to worry about that later. By far, going hungry was the worst part of all of this. As long as he had food, everything else that was crappy in his life was that much easier to deal with. Naruto let himself smile and plopped down for a quick nap on one of the many park benches scattered around Konoha. 2 more years, just 2 more years and I'll be old enough to join the Ninja Academy. I'll finally be able to be a shinobi. I can't wait. He thrust a fist into the air, making a determined expression as he let his imagination wander. The boy grinned and laughed to himself. Yeah, I'll be the greatest shinobi Konohagakure has ever seen. Me, Naruto Uzumaki, I'll make everyone acknowledge me with all the amazing things I'll do once I'm a ninja. His imagination soared. He pictured himself clad in Jonin gear with his own creative touches, standing in front of a crowd of Konoha villagers cheering his name as he posed triumphantly. I'm gonna be the best ninja in the world. They'll practically beg me to be the next Hokage by the time I'm done. His grin grew wider and he clutched his fists against his cheeks, bubbling with excitement. He, yeah, they'll see, they'll all see, I'll prove myself to all of them. Everyone will finally acknowledge me, I'll never have to be alone again. Naruto let his arms drop to his sides and he exhaled, keeping the big grin firmly planted on his face while his imagination continued producing scenarios of himself as the center of attention due to assorted heroics and other imagined accomplishments. He looked to the side and watched the leaves gently float past, appreciating the gentle breeze and listening to the leaves rustling in the trees nearby. Sleep soon embraced him, though, to his horror, he found himself waking up in the dark hallway again. What the hell? I thought this freaky place only showed up at night. He said out loud. Darn it, and it was such a good day too, he added with an exaggerated pout. Naruto's attention was drawn to the far end of the hallway when he heard what he thought to be whimpering of some kind. It sounded to him like someone was in pain. Then the thought hit him, holy crap, what if whatever that is at the end of the hallway, what if that's someone trapped or injured, or worse? The boy facepalmed and growled, RRGH, I'm such an idiot. This whole time he's been calling for help and I've been ignoring him. Whoever this is, if I can find them and help them, maybe I can finally get some sleep again and be done with this funhouse reject of a place. He chuckled with a half-satisfaction at his witty jab at the stature of the hallway. Eventually he looked towards the far end with an uncertain half-brave expression on his face. Okay, it's now or never. There's someone trapped in there, and I'm gonna do whatever I can to save him. Time to be a hero. He tried to psyche himself up, but with limited results. Naruto gulped and took cautious steps towards the sounds, despite everything in his mind yelling at him to go in the exact opposite direction. He wasn't sure what he'd been expecting to see at the end of that hallway, but it definitely wasn't a giant orange fox monster. Oh, was the only word that came into his mind as he stood there, staring into the crimson eyes of this enormous fox thing. And this had all lead to the situation the boy currently found himself in. Place: Fox's cage. Time: N.A. Flashback end. Naruto watched the fox and noted how he was still staring at the ceiling, holding his hands up like an artist would to plan out one of his paintings. The heck is he even looking at? There's nothing up there but a boring old ceiling, he thought to himself as he leaned forward to get a better angle looking into the cage. The boy stood there in silent observation, watching as the fox dipped one of its tails into the water and then proceeded to drag the tip of its tail across the ceiling like he was pretending to paint. His imagination quickly produced the image of the giant fox wearing a painter's smock and hat, standing in front of a priceless work of art in one of those fancy art exhibits and bragging to a bunch of rich snobs. He couldn't help but chuckle at the mental imagery, slapping his hand to his mouth to stifle the inevitable laughter as his imagination continued along this train of thought. He wasn't entirely sure why the image of a giant fox demon in artist's attire was funny to him at this very moment, but he couldn't help himself. The fox's ear twitched at the sound of muffled laughter. The boy froze and paled as the fox turned and looked right at him with a less than amused expression. Am I amusing you, boy? He asked in his lower volume, yet still deep and managing to convey an air of power and presence. At least, that's what the fancy books would have called it. And no, I was just, I was remembering a really funny joke. That's all, honest. The boy managed to get out without letting his voice convey how utterly terrified he was at that moment. The fox merely stared down the boy with a blank expression and slowly blinked a couple times before he answered with a single huff of disbelief. The silence was deafening as the two simply stared at one another again, just like the last time. This time though, the fox had a neutral expression, and the boy was trying to keep a brave face despite how intimidated and frightened he was by the giant orange fox. Eventually the silence was broken by the fox. So, boy, is it safe to assume that you'll run away again, soiling your pants like last time, or are you willing to stick around long enough for us to at least have a full sentence of conversation? He stated, having a smirk on his face after he made the not-so-subtle jab at the boy's actions earlier. He'd done that more as a ruse to try and goad the boy into getting a bit of foolish bravery due to the hurt pride, rather than from any desire to insult him. He felt like he'd had experience in dealing with humans before, from where or when and with whom, he had no clue, but he at least had knowledge in his mind. He hoped that this would work, but the boy was fairly young, still a mere child by his demeanor and appearance. He wasn't entirely sure if kids even had pride, but it was worth a shot. Much to the fox's relief, the endeavor wasn't a waste of time, as he'd gotten a significant enough rise out of the boy that he was confident he didn't have to worry about him fleeing again too soon, at least enough to get his name. "I did not pee my pants, you big dumb fox," the boy defiantly declared. This caused the fox to chuckle, which in turn made the boy huff angrily and fold his arms. "Fine, whatever, I'll stick around and hear what you wanna say. You won't let me sleep if I don't. I haven't been able to sleep right for over a month, ever since you started waking me up with all your hollering and crap." The boy glared at the fox glared right back. That statement made the fox's fur bristle in a moment of rage. He heard me. This whole time, this damned brat heard me, and he's only just now acting on it. The fox leapt up from his position and grabbed the bars of the gate with a snarl emitting from his lips and a furious expression on his face. "You heard me. This whole time, you could hear me, and you did nothing about it up until now." Venom dripped from every word he bit out. The boy couldn't help but fall backward onto his rump, trembling in fear at the sight of the enraged fox, terror gripping into his heart as he watched the gate with his breath held and silently prayed that the gate stood strong. He still wasn't entirely sure how much of this was real or not, but he didn't want to take the chance of that fox getting to him and it ending up being real all along. The boy gulped and slowly got back to his feet and stood his ground, figuring that so long as that gate held, he'd be safe, but if the gate failed, he would have no way of getting away quickly enough before the fox caught him anyway. He breathed a small amount of relief as he noted that the gate seemed just as secure as it had been moments ago. He folded his arms again and struggled to try and look less terrified than he was. "I don't know who, or what you are, and I don't know where, this place is," he said with his arms waving about in a general fashion, fighting back the fearful tone that creeped into his voice with his best effort. "How the heck was I supposed to react to waking up from voices in the middle of the night? I thought I was just going crazy or something. I didn't know there was a real person talking to me. Now here you are, some giant demon fox. I've heard stories of people going crazy and hearing voices, you know." I was scared. He'd made the best of his newfound bravery in the situation, being fueled further as he saw the fox's reaction. Apparently, he'd made a good point, because the fox's expression changed from raw fury to the face of someone who'd just decisively lost an argument and had the wind knocked out of their sails. In the fox's mind, he was chastising himself with no small quantity of vitriol. He'd just been taken down several pegs by this blonde-haired idiot of a child, and the sting it left in his own pride rivaled the pain he'd felt in his headaches from before. His jab at the boy's pride had practically backfired, though, to be fair, he did manage to accomplish his intended goal. "This is humiliating, but at least I managed to salvage the situation, I think." He shrugged and shook his head. "I'll take whatever I can get at this point." He took a deep breath and sighed. "Look, boy, I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot here." He spoke in as calmly a tone as possible, going full diplomacy mode as best he could and having as close to a matching expression as he could muster in his current state of singed pride. The boy simply snorted and glared back at the fox, taking full advantage of his newfound bravery. Yeah, no kidding. The fox resisted the urge to bite out a retort, deciding that he'd suffer through the blonde's disrespect just long enough to get some use out of him. I'm in a bit of a predicament, as you can see. The fox motioned with his hands, gesturing to his prison. The blonde-haired boy merely raised his eyebrows and nodded with a grin, pointing at the fox. I can see that, despite all that rage, you're just a fox in a cage, he said, barely able to keep from laughing long enough to finish his sentence. The fox had a clearly not amused expression on his face. He stared at the boy, casting all manner of silent judgment towards his poor taste in humor before finally speaking. Really, was all he said with a very condescending tone, the boy continuing to laugh at his abysmal pun. The fox groaned and rubbed his fingers over the bridge of his snout. I don't deserve this. After the boy stopped laughing, he looked back at the fox and shrugged. What? It was just a joke, lighten up. To which the fox responded, that was possibly the worst pun in the history of this entire planet. The blonde defiantly furrowed his brow and folded his arms again. Oh come on, it wasn't that bad. The fox shook his head in disagreement. Yes it was, never do that again. The boy simply sighed and mumbled to himself, yeesh, what is with everyone I meet having such a crappy sense of humor? The fox lowered his head slightly and looked the blonde in the eyes. Have you ever stopped and considered that maybe, just maybe, it's you who has the crappy sense of humor? The blonde dismissed that and laughed. That's what they all say. You should see my pranks though, those are pure gold. The fox blinked. Oh great, a prankster, just what I needed. Then the thought flicked into his mind, wait a minute, maybe that is just what I need right now. He went down to meet eye level with the blonde, at least, as well as could be managed given the immense size difference between them. Pranks you say? Interesting. Have you ever picked a lock before, by any chance? The blonde shrugged and replied with a cautious, once or twice, maybe, why do you ask? This made the fox grin in his mind. Well, do you think you could take a look at your side of the gate and see if you can fiddle with the lock? The boy, momentarily forgetting that he was talking to a giant fox monster after it had finged interest in his hobby, tilted his head and furrowed his brow in confusion. Lock? What lock? The fox restrained his anger and frustration for the moment. The lock, boy, the lock keeping this gate held shut, obviously. The frustration barely contained in his voice. The blonde looked over the gate and shook his head. I don't see any lock, it's just a big gate with a giant piece of paper slapped onto the middle where the two gate doors meet. It's got a big symbol on it like what you'd see in those older books and scrolls, or comics. You think it might be cursed or something. The fox had a flicker of knowledge enter his mind. He swore out loud, making the blonde flinch. So, is that a yes or a no? The blonde asked nervously. No, the gate's sealed shut, probably using some sort of fancy spell or magic that neither of us have any hope of undoing. I doubt you'll be of much use to me at this point. The fox uttered in a defeated tone. After glancing around uneasily for a moment, the boy finally spoke and tried to ease the tension, not even as a snack. He asked with a chuckle and a nervous smile. The fox managed to crack a smile at this. No, I'm not going to eat you, boy, it stated, though quickly added in a humorous gesture, you'd probably taste terrible anyway. The boy indignantly responded with, hey, I taste just fine. But quickly corrected himself and said, no, you're right, I taste terrible. You wouldn't want to eat me. Hey. A few minutes passed. The fox flopped over onto his side and lay there on the wet ground. His expression was thoughtful, depressed. The blonde couldn't tell. He'd never been very good at reading people's emotions under normal circumstances, and the fact that this was a giant fox demon just made things that much more difficult. So, He started with an air of uncertainty and reluctance. The fox's ear twitched in response, though he made no effort to move other than that. What's your name, anyways? This made the fox raise an eyebrow and tilt his head just enough to cast one of his eyes to gaze over the boy. Why do you ask? Well, I mean, if you're stuck here and I can't let you out, and I'm gonna be stuck being brought here too and hearing you at night and stuff, we might as well know each other's names, right? The boy said with a smile. He seemed much less afraid now, though traces of fear still mingled in his tone from time to time. So, what's your name? The fox sighed. Well, I suppose maybe I can find some other use for him. It's not like I have any other options at my disposal. Ah, what the hell? The fox shrugged and turned his head to face the boy. Truthfully, I can't quite remember my name. I woke up in this place without any recollection of anything prior to waking up. I can't so much as identify who, or what I am. The blonde tilted his head. Rico, what? The fox dragged his hand over his own face in mild annoyance and reiterated in layman's terms, what I'm trying to say, is that I lost my memories. I can't remember anything about who I was before I woke up in this cage. The child nodded in understanding. Oh, I gotcha. The fox wasn't interested in making friends, but he figured he'd at least be civil with the brat in the off chance that he could turn out to be useful at some point. After all, he was the only living thing to have come forth after his numerous sessions of rage and screaming at the top of his lungs. He didn't like it, but what other options did he have? I assume you have a name though, correct? The fox forced himself to say. The blonde-haired boy had been caught off guard by the question, having been perplexed by hearing the fox tell him that he wasn't able to remember his own name, and feeling a moment of sympathy for the big fox, judging by the expression on the boy's face. Huh, was all the boy said in response. What is your name, boy? The fox asked again, this time with a hint of annoyance in his voice. The boy's expression warmed up and took on a smile. I'm Naruto Uzumaki. I'm gonna be the greatest ninja Konoha has ever seen. He stated as if he'd recited the line at least 100 times prior. The fox grinned, trying to give off as friendly an expression as he could muster. Naruto Uzumaki. I see. Well, it is nice to make your acquaintance, Naruto Uzumaki. The fox paid no mind when the boy tilted his head in confusion at some of the words he used. Naruto didn't quite have his vocabulary filled out just yet, it seemed. He paid no mind to this and pretended to yawn, struggling to keep consistent with his diplomacy mode. I think it's about time for me to take a nap, so I'll let you get back to whatever it is you were doing, for now. Naruto replied to this with a slightly annoyed tone and mild sass. I was sleeping. You know, that thing that I have to do every night. That thing that you keep waking me up from. Right, about that. I'll be sure to try and not wake you up in the middle of the night anymore, but in return, I expect you to respond when you hear me from now on. Do we have a deal? Naruto nodded, relief washing over him at the prospect of getting a decent night's sleep again and going back to a stable schedule. He was also very relieved that at least the fox wasn't some mindless rage demon thing like he'd thought before. He seems like an okay kind of guy. I guess, Naruto thought to himself, at least as far as giant fox monsters go. Why yeah, sure, it's a deal. Naruto still didn't know exactly what would come after all this, but he was happy to at least have the reassurance that he wouldn't have to be worrying about the screaming in the night anymore. That was a win in his book. The fox had a broad grin on his face as Naruto turned to leave, though the boy had no idea how to get out of this place. After staring out into the hallway for a good few minutes, he shrugged and simply sat in one of the corners outside of the cage and waited for himself to eventually wake up. He faded out of the room after the fox assumed he woke up, Though this entire situation was still also very confusing, meeting the brat was of benefit, sure, but it also further added in more perplexing elements to this already elaborate puzzle. The fox chuckled to himself and praised the luck he'd been given in meeting Naruto. Not only is this brat easy to negotiate with, but he's got plans to become a ninja. I can work with that. Oh yes, I can most definitely work with that. He breathed deeply and rolled over to get more comfortable. If I have to make nice with this blonde idiot in order to get free of this cage and learn more about myself and how I wound up in here, that's a price I'm more than willing to pay. I'll put up with the brat for as long as it takes. Who knows, this little adventure might even be entertaining. The fox laughed aloud, letting his mind wander at the possibilities and potential for some time. He deemed the interaction to have been a huge success, despite how painfully awkward it had been in retrospect. Naruto Uzumaki, you may prove to be very useful to me indeed. He gradually let his eyes shut, slowly wrapping his tails under himself to act as makeshift pillows and bedding, and although he hadn't intended to actually sleep, he soon found himself falling asleep anyway. Naruto was seated at one of the bar stools of Ramen Ichiraku, polishing off his first serving of the delectable noodle soup. He held the bowl up to his mouth and drank up the remaining broth in one go, exhaling in an exaggerated fashion once he'd fully finished the meal. Man, that was tasty, thanks Tuki-san. He stated with a satisfied grin on his face. The chef behind the counter smiled and waved it off. It's no trouble at all, Naruto-kun, always happy to reserve a free bowl on occasion for my favorite customer. Tuki retrieved the empty bowl while Naruto sat and sipped at the remainder of the soft drink he'd ordered to go with his ramen. A long while back, the chef had correctly guessed by Naruto's behavior that this was likely the only warm meal the boy ever got, but he'd intended that to be just a casual joke. It deeply saddened him to have had that be confirmed as reality, especially after he witnessed firsthand how the other shopkeepers would either refuse to serve him outright, or they'd charge him exorbitant amounts of money for something as simple as a loaf of bread. He'd since then decided to take it upon himself to ensure that the boy at least had someplace he could go to as a source for meals. It wasn't much, but it was the best he could do for the boy, given how some of the more petty customers had decided to boycott him for serving the one they referred to as the demon child. Ignorant cowards, treating a child in such a way, Tuki always dismissed them. He believed Naruto was a good kid, and he could prove it if anyone ever gave him the chance no matter what anyone else said. So, Naruto-kun, another serving of the usual. The cheerful ramen chef asked of the boy. Naruto was about to respond when his mind echoed with the familiar voice of the fox. Naruto, I need to speak with you, return to my prison as soon as you are able to. Naruto silently groaned, now having his lunch interrupted by that damned fox. It was great not having the fox wake him up at night anymore, but it was still really frustrating that he kept calling out to him during the worst possible moments. Why does he always do this? It's like he purposely waits until I'm in the middle of doing something to ask me to come see him. He sighed and shook his head to Tuki. Not right now, I've gotta go take care of something first. I'll catch you later, Tuki-san. Naruto hopped off the barstool, waving to the ramen chef and his daughter before heading home. Tuki waved back, you take care of yourself, Naruto-kun. There's always a bar stool for my best customer. Naruto made it back to his apartment and locked the door behind himself, kicking off his shoes before heading over to his bed. He plopped onto the sheets and rolled onto his back, laying there with his eyes closed and the image of the fox's prison held in his mind as best as he could manage. Over the past few days, he and the fox had struggled to figure out a means to reliably communicate with one another when they needed to. Well, when the fox needed to, at least. Naruto could always hear the fox, but no matter what Naruto tried, he couldn't speak to the fox in return unless he went back to that creepy place the fox was imprisoned in. It was irritating and inconvenient, but the method they'd worked out was, at the very least, functional. Naruto would have to mimic going to sleep with the image of that horrible place in his mind, no small feat for the boy as it required a decent amount of focus, and focus was something that Naruto simply lacked, unless ramen or shinobi feats were involved. If he did it right, he would open his eyes and find himself standing in front of the gate. If not, the fox would mockingly tell him to try again, boy. The blonde stood before the gate once again, looking up at the fox and folding his arms. "What's up, fox?" he would casually ask. He didn't bother to inform the fox that he'd interrupted him during lunch for the 5th time this week, as the fox only took a manner of satisfaction from hearing how he was inconveniencing the boy. Sometimes the fox even gave him a witty response that mocked his annoyance. The past several calls, the fox simply asked Naruto dumb questions like how old he was, where he lived, who his parents were, stuff like that. Naruto hadn't noticed it at the time, but the fox recoiled and briefly changed his facial expression upon hearing for the first time that Naruto was an orphan and had been since the day he was born. Naruto hadn't thought anything of it at the time. After all, he never knew who his parents were, so why should he care if he didn't have them? This time, however, the fox looked like he had something important to say for a change. "I've come up with a new theory, and I believe I've proven this one to be correct over the past few days. I also think I've devised a better way for us to communicate." The first time Naruto had heard the fox say, theory, he had to ask Tsuki and his daughter Ayame what the word meant, because the fox had grown tired of constantly explaining what all the fancier words meant and refused to use a simpler vocabulary. "And?" Naruto asked, tilting his head slightly as he waited for the fox to continue. "We seem to share some sort of connection, mentally. After careful observations of Maid, I believe I can confirm it 100%. Naruto raised an eyebrow. "Yeah. So, what's so important about that? Didn't you figure that out when we first met?" The fox simply shook his head and spoke with a tone that was laced with mild annoyance. "It's more than simply you being able to hear me, brat. I've discovered that I'm able to see some of the things that you see, in addition to hearing some of the things you hear. If I concentrate, I can get a clearer sound and image. I think it will come to be useful in our future endeavors if I can refine it and figure out its nuances. This may be a way we can actively communicate, albeit indirectly." Naruto couldn't help but lightly scrunch up his face at that, making the fox momentarily thin his eyes at the boy. "Why are you looking at me like that? Did I use too many big words again?" He'd added the last part with a mocking tone. Naruto reached behind his head sheepishly. "No, well, maybe, but that's kinda weird, don'cha think? I mean, you being able to see what I can see and stuff, isn't that kinda like peeping?" The fox lightly recoiled and furrowed his brows in an expression of contempt. "Of course not. Get your mind out of the gutter, you juvenile idiot. Like I said, it can be used to better communicate. If I can focus enough, I can send you a message the usual way, and you may be able to respond back without having to come all the way back here. Don't you understand?" After several minutes of trying to explain things to Naruto, the fox gave up, seeing that Naruto simply wasn't following along. "It's not like this fool has to understand how this works for us to be able to gain benefit from it." The fox sighed and decided to move on to more important matters. He cleared his throat to get Naruto's attention. "Moving on to other matters I wished to speak to you about, I think it's time for us to do some digging and figure out what exactly I'm supposed to be." Naruto nodded slowly. "By us, you mean me, right?" "Precisely. Does your village have a knowledge storage facility? A place where literature and writing is kept?" Naruto had a look of momentary confusion on his face before he stated hesitantly, "You mean like, a library? That sounds like it should suffice, yes." Naruto rolled his head back and let out a loud groan, "But I hate reading. It's so boring." The fox merely blinked at Naruto's choice of words and gave him a look that said, "Cry me a river, you brat," before voicing the very line his facial expression was conveying. Upon his return to reality, Naruto groaned again and lazily rolled out of bed. "Man, this stinks, but that damn fox is just gonna nag me again like last time unless I go and do it." The boy sighed and stretched a few times before going over to throw his shoes on and head out. He hated the idea of having to go and sift through a bunch of boring old books and scrolls, but he didn't have much of a choice. The fox tried to play it up like it'd be more fun than it actually would be, by suggesting he could learn things that would give him a head start in the ninja academy. "Yeah, right. Books are still boring, stupid fox. Why couldn't someone else have to deal with this guy? Why'd it have to be me with the nagging, grumpy, fox monster?" He was on his way to Konoha Library by now, though he was taking his time and procrastinating as much as possible. "Yeesh, I know I was wishing for adventure and stuff, but I didn't want it to include reading," he muttered under his breath. "You could be locked up in a cage all day." Naruto nearly faceplanted by the sudden intrusion into his thoughts, clearly not expecting anyone to respond to what he was thinking out loud to himself. He shot an angry retort, "Hey! No one asked you, Datbeo." He looked around, but saw that no one had been talking to him, and that several villagers were now looking at him oddly. "That was smart. Now people are going to think you're going crazy." Naruto gritted his teeth in annoyance and muttered a response, "You can hear me now." The fox laughed and replied with a smug, "Speak up, boy, I can't hear you," causing Naruto to let out a frustrated growl. "If you had paid any attention at all, you would understand how I'm doing this. I literally explained everything to you earlier, but you were too busy complaining. Now quit fooling around and get to the library." Naruto eventually made it to the Konoha Public Library, stopping just short of the entrance and ducking into cover. After a few moments, the fox spoke, "Naruto, what are you doing?" To which Naruto replied in a whisper, "Hiding, duh. One of the librarians here hates me. I'm waiting to see if they're here today." Naruto quickly snuck a peek through the main door, sighing in relief when he saw no evidence that the librarian was nearby. "I'm almost afraid to ask, but what sort of elaborate scheme did you manage to pull off in order for you to now be afraid of coming face to face with the librarian?" Naruto simply grinned and laughed as he recalled that day. Naruto waited until it was dark out before he executed his plan. This one was going to be a prank to remember, and he had all the time in the world. He picked the lock to the library's back entrance and quickly ducked inside. Once he'd closed the door quietly behind himself, he rubbed his hands together, cackling maniacally, though quietly. "Time to get to work, Datbeo," he declared in his head, and then proceeded to spend the rest of the night taking a large quantity of the books from both the fiction and non-fiction sections of the libraries in equal quantities and randomly swapping them. By the time he was done, dawn was approaching and nearly half of the library's fiction and the non-fiction sections had been swapped with one another. The best part was that it'd be almost impossible to tell unless you took the books out and checked the titles. Naruto snuck back out of the library, locking the door as he left to ensure no one would be any wiser, and then found a hiding spot to watch and wait for the librarian to start his day. Naruto counted down from 10 once his primary target had arrived and stepped inside. He could barely keep himself from laughing, clutching a hand over his mouth and nose to prevent any sounds of his giggling from escaping. Right after Naruto reached 1 in his countdown, a long, drawn-out and bellowing scream of pure outrage and disbelief was heard coming from within the library, followed immediately by the cackling laughter of the perpetrator. The scream of despair and childish laughter could be heard from the walls of Konoha. In a park near the walls, a young boy with red markings in the shape of fangs on his cheeks turned and asked a woman with similar markings on her own cheeks, "Mum, what the heck is that sound?" To which the woman only shook her head and said, "Idle hands, Kiba-kun, idle hands." The dogs nearby barked in agreement. Flashback end. The fox was speechless for a good amount of time after that. "You have far too much time on your hands," was eventually spoken. "Why does everyone say that?" the blonde said indignantly, though he ignored further conversation with the fox and focused on sneaking his way into the library. "So, that's why this librarian hates you." Naruto simply blew a raspberry with his tongue. "Heck no, they never found out it was me. This old geezer hates me because you have an outstanding reputation as a prankster, a general public nuisance, and a thief." The blonde's eyes went wide and he quickly shot back a defense, "That's not fair. I only took money from rich snobs, and it was only because those jerks in the market district keep making me pay more money than everyone else." The fox snorted, not buying Naruto's excuses. The fox refocused the conversation, "So, what does this scary librarian of yours look like?" Naruto huffed before he responded, "He's an old geezer. He's got thick, obnoxious old guy glasses, and his face only ever has one expression, grumpy. You can't miss him." Luckily, there was someone new tending to the duties at the reception desk. He seemed more interested in reading a graphic novel than paying attention to what was going on in the library. The other librarians also seemed busy tending to their duties in areas that the boy could easily sneak past or avoid outright. Naruto took the opportunity to sneak past the receptionist when it presented itself. He'd gotten a knack for going around unnoticed when he needed to, though his obsession with wearing clothing with orange as the primary color often hampered his efforts, something the fox pointed out several times and which Naruto fervently denied. The blonde snuck past successfully, and stopped at one of the bookcase junctions to inquire with the fox in his head. "So, what are we looking for, Rye Fox?" "For the last time, don't call me that," came the fox's agitated response. Naruto countered with, "Then help me come up with a name for you." "I don't want a name, and I don't need a name. Especially not a name that you come up with." Naruto scoffed, "Hey, I come up with awesome names, you're just too picky." Coming from the boy who thought Fen was a suitable name, because, and I quote, "It's short for fennec fox, and you look like a fennec fox," not only was it bland and mindlessly simple, but it was insulting. Naruto just shrugged and made a face. "I thought it was a nice name, and besides, you kinda do look like a fennec fox, at least your face does." The fox folded his arms and scowled, No, I do not." Naruto had made it further into the library now, though he was still arguing with the fox under his breath, "Hey, at least my suggestions were better than Sujirao. I mean, talk about boring. It was descriptive and accurately accounted for my attributes." The fox said in his defense, taking further offense to the boy's remarks. Naruto shook his head, "Whatever, your names stink. What are we looking for in here anyway? The quicker I can get out of here the better. I hate books and books hate me." The fox growled, but decided the task at hand was infinitely more important than arguing with a 6-year-old. He also chastised himself for arguing with a 6-year-old. "We're looking for anything on mythological creatures. I'm obviously not a regular animal, so there's no point looking up documents on natural creatures." Naruto his head to the side, "Mytho what now?" The fox groaned and dragged his hand over his face, "Magical creatures. Like in those comic books you read," he added with an annoyed tone. Naruto's face lit up and he exclaimed, "Oh yeah, I know what those are." He then went off to look in the fiction section of the library. After several minutes of searching, Naruto pulled out a book with some fancy title he didn't understand, but the cover had the picture of a plethora of magical creatures on it that he recognized from the comics he liked to read, the only time he ever liked to read anything at all, so it seemed like the right place to start. Okay, I can do this, just gotta read this gigantic book. His demeanor soured and he reluctantly cracked open the book. Well, at least it has pictures, this'll make it easier. The blonde moved over to a table and set the book down, doing his best to focus on the book despite his mind actively trying to find anything and everything to distract itself with. Remember, you don't have to read the whole book, just anything that seems like it could give us an idea of what I am. The fox offered as a suggestion. Naruto nodded. I know www. He dragged the end of the word in a whiny manner, which the fox chastised him for. Look, brat, I don't like this situation any more than you do. Naruto muttered something under his breath about the fox not being the one having to sit through a boring old book. The blonde sat there and flipped through page after page of magical and mythological creatures. Some of these are kinda cool. Eventually something caught Naruto's eye. Huh. Oh, hey, Rai Fox, check this out. The blonde pointed out a picture and several passages. The title read, Kitsune, and one of the pictures depicted a beautiful woman with fox-like features and a cluster of fox tails trailing behind her. The picture next to it showed a picture depicting a multi-tailed fox creature. Though the fox in the picture looked nothing like the fox Naruto currently was tied to in his mind, the resemblance was close enough, at least to Naruto. The blonde sat and read through the passages on the kitsune, the fox read with him, helping him when a new word tripped him up. The duo eventually finished reading, and the fox was the first to speak. I can kind of see a resemblance, but I don't think I'm the same creature depicted in this book. Naruto, of course, was convinced enough. Nah, you're totally a kitsune. See, it's right here in the book, and it totally makes sense. The fox decided not to argue the point. After all, Naruto was a 6-year-old, a fact that the fox constantly had to remind itself of every time it spoke with the boy. Well, so according to our new information, I may be in some sort of spiritual prison, and the seal theory is confirmed. There's no way we're breaking me out of this prison anytime soon. I have a better grasp on what I am, and things are starting to make more sense at the very least. Naruto looked at the picture of the woman for a few moments. Hey, Rai Fox. The fox dragged a hand over its face and groaned out the phrase, "Stop calling me that. Why can't you look like her?" The boy stated while pointing to the image of the kitsune woman. The fox was dumbfounded. He could find the words to speak. It'd be so much easier to talk to you face to face if you were pretty like she is. There was silence for a few moments as the fox desperately composed himself. The fox had decided that he was a male. Given the fact that he had nothing to physically determine such a thing, his only frame of reference regarding something like his gender was Naruto. He didn't quite understand why it bothered him so much, only that it did, and that he felt the need to chastise the boy for it. Naruto? The fox asked in a deceptively kind tone. Yeah, I'm fairly certain I can't look like her, because I'm a boy. Or did you forget that little detail? There was a bit of venom in each phrase as the fox said that. The blonde's face fell forward onto the desk. A drawn-out sound of disappointment left his mouth as he sat there with his forehead firmly planted onto the wooden desk. The fox, flustered by the implications despite not entirely understanding why, brushed it off and tried to hide his annoyance and discomfort and the awkwardness of it all. HMPH. As if you didn't have enough difficulty paying attention to me as it is, the last thing you need is perverted thoughts distracting you. Besides, you're 6, you shouldn't even be concerned with such things. Naruto tilted his head at the accusation. What? I was just talking about you not having to be a giant, scary fox monster. What are you talking about? The thought, 6 years old, flashed through the fox's mind again. Never mind. Forget I said anything. No, really, what the heck were you talking about? Naruto further questioned. The fox thought quickly, not liking where this was going. I said it wasn't important, so drop it. Wah, but I. The fox then broke communication and sat there staring at the flooded floor of his cage for a good few minutes. The conversation very nearly went down a path of dialogue he did not feel comfortable having with a 6-year-old. He had a very bothered expression on his face that gradually went away as he wiped his brow in relief, letting out a deep exhale as he did so. Wow, that became awkward very quickly. I keep forgetting that the brat is only 6. Naruto scratched his head in confusion. What was that all about? But he shrugged and went about reading on kitsunes, going and getting another suitable book from nearby and skimming through it. He hated being in the library, but at least he didn't have to be stuck going through a ton of books aimlessly. He had the creature nailed down. All he had to do was skim through these dumb books and find that one specific creature. This became even easier when the fox helped him learn to use the table of contents. By the time the fox told him, that should be enough information, you can go now, brat. Naruto had amassed a rather large pile of books on the table. He let out a huge sigh of relief and wasted no time hopping up and away from the chair and desk. The fox shook his head. I at least have a general idea of what I am now. Assuming Naruto was right, or at least, partially right. I'm not simply busting out of this prison at any rate. I'm sealed in here by some sort of supernatural means, and the only way I can get out of here is to learn how to remove said supernatural seals. The fox scratched his chin, deep in thought. If I am a kitsune, then I have a baseline for potential abilities at my disposal. I can start experimenting using the information in the books as a reference. This will probably take some time, assuming it's not muscle memory related and I have to relearn everything from scratch. It's not like I have anything else to do, besides chat with the brat, which I'm not doing anytime soon anyway. Last thing I need is him bringing that up while it's still fresh in his mind. The fox imagined Naruto badgering him over and over again, seeing if he could achieve a form like what was depicted in the first book. He shuddered at the thought, having no means to force Naruto to leave should he decide to visit him in this prison of his own accord. Why did it have to have questionable pictures? After several minutes, the fox eyed his reflection, then a thought wormed its way into his mind. He mulled over what the boy had said earlier. I wonder. His mind wandered, questioning the concept of what made him think of himself as male, trying to determine physical features that could allude to his identity as a male. He felt comfortable stating that he was male. Something in his mind told him he was a male, and it made sense given his masculine voice and his physical build. Nevertheless, he experimented with forming an appearance in his mind, and he eventually found himself imagining what he would look like if he were a female kitsune out of curiosity. He couldn't help but have a stupid grin creep across his face as the image solidified itself in his mind. I think I'd look quite nice as a female, actually. Though he shook off such thoughts as irrelevant to his situation, he'd have plenty of time to worry about such trivial and petty things in the future. Meanwhile, back in the library, Naruto had put the book back where he found it, at least where he thought he remembered pulling it from, and was attempting to sneak out the library the same way he came in. Unfortunately for him, the individual that had been at the reception desk previously had clocked out, and the grumpy old librarian had taken his place. Oh no! The blonde's mind was racing, looking for options on how to escape the current situation. It never occurred to the boy that no one had actually seen Naruto executing his infamous library prank, so he had no way of proving it was him. That didn't exactly change anything, as the grouchy old man still didn't much care for the blonde due to his reputation. It came as no surprise when Naruto was instantly spotted by the eagle-eyed old man. The thick-rimmed glasses and signature scowl were as easily identifiable as his voice when he leapt up from his desk and said in a commanding voice, "Uzumaki." Naruto froze on the spot. Oh, no, it wasn't that the boy was scared of the librarian, so much as he despised the habit the librarian had of giving him boring, drawn-out lectures whenever possible. "How in the realms did you manage to sneak in here without my knowing?" He marched over to the blonde and stood before him, raising an eyebrow and folding his arms expectantly. "This library is a place for learning, not some downtrodden park a prankster like you can go around plotting and scheming in." Naruto's mind raced furiously. The old librarian was beginning one of his notorious lectures that he always had ready for boys' mind grasped at any possible means of getting out of this situation. He could see the exit not too far behind the old geezer. If he could just distract the man long enough, he could make a break for it and be out of there. An idea popping into his head, Naruto reached into his pocket and then drew it out and threw the contents at the librarian in a swift, fluid motion. "Pokoto Suna no Jutsu," he shouted as the spray of pocket lint, dirt and sand flew out in a tiny cloud at the librarian's face, momentarily obscuring the old man's vision and forcing him to recoil and sputter at the debris. The old man yanked off his glasses and quickly wiped the dirt and dust from them, and brushed the rest of the pocket sand and lint off of his face. By the time the old man had cleared the dirt and dust from his person and had restored his vision, the blonde was long gone. "Bah! Annoying little wretch. That wasn't even a proper jutsu." The librarian returned to his desk. "How odd though, I've heard of the brat's pranking reputation, but I was honestly expecting something a little more than just throwing pocket sand at." It was at that moment that the librarian noticed across the way that several of the table chairs had been taken and neatly stacked and balanced to form a bridge between two of the bookshelves in the fiction section. His eyes and mouth went wide as he took in the spectacle, leaving him to merely utter, "Wah, when did he I? How?" After making sure that he hadn't been followed, the blonde strolled up to Ramen Ichiraku, pulling out his frog wallet. There were a few other patrons at the ramen stand at the moment, so Naruto took a seat at the far end of the bar, keeping out of their way and avoiding eye contact. He quietly placed some ryo onto the counter and Ayame nodded in response. Within a few minutes, a piping hot bowl of pork ramen was placed in front of the blonde, which he happily devoured after giving a smile and a nod of thanks to Ayame. Meanwhile, the fox was racking his brain, trying to discover any abilities he might be able to call upon, thinking back to the reading material on kitsunes. After several long periods of straining his mind and body, looking for any kind of response, or any hint of what to look for, he sighed and plopped onto the floor. "Nothing, and I bet it has to do with this damned seal. It'd be just my luck that this thing would be nullifying my powers or something." He sat back up and closed his eyes, thinking deeply, though taking care to avoid trying to remember anything from his past, as he was not eager to relive the headaches from his first days in this wretched prison. The fox cleared his mind, deciding for a different approach. Clearly it's nothing physical, so perhaps, he focused and concentrated, keeping his mind clear and reaching out for any semblance of direction. His tails fluttered and whisked about, he felt something, an energy of some sort. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it was familiar to him. The fox continued to focus and keep his mind cleared, following this feeling, this energy, wherever it would lead him. Eventually, he opened his eyes, after feeling confident in this new sensation he felt. A glowing red substance was flowing around the fox, almost like fire or smoke, maybe a mix of both. What is this? He asked aloud, taking in the mysterious substance's appearance and feeling. It rippled with power as it flowed over his body. It gave the fox a sense of might, ferocity. It made him feel unstoppable, despite not understanding why or how. An alarming revelation was how this energy also seemed to bring out feelings of anger and hatred, and it actively fed off of those emotions in a moderately vicious cycle. It doesn't make any sense. The book never mentioned anything about this. In a moment of sudden dread, the fox panicked and dissipated the energy as best he could. He looked down at his reflection, ears drooping back in uncertainty. What the hell am I? In the 2 days that followed, Naruto made additional trips to the library upon the fox's request. He searched up such exciting topics as magical energies, and aura, and various other terms that sounded cool at first, but when investigated he'd very quickly found himself bored to death with. Having tired of arguing with the blonde trying to get him to pay attention and read, the fox eventually simply said, "Just look at the damn book so at least I can see it and read it myself." Naruto was still bored out of his mind, but at least he didn't have to read the books anymore himself. He just had to have the books open and keep his eyes in their general direction so the fox could see. Other than that, he was free to let his mind wander. Meh, better than having to read. The fox cursed to himself every time his research proved fruitless, for every single term he could think of. Damn it, what the hell am I missing? What else could it be? Useless, useless, he declared and slammed his tails into one of the walls. Naruto was currently standing in front of the gate, surprising the fox, but doing nothing to improve his mood. What's wrong, Rye Fox? The blonde asked with an innocent smile on his face. The fox glared in return. How did you do that? Did you seriously fall asleep in the library? Naruto rubbed the back of his neck with a sheepish look on his face. Hey, I dunno, actually. I just kinda thought about this place and let my mind wander into it, I guess. The fox raised his eyebrows, his mouth slightly ajar. That's actually rather impressive, boy. Unintentional as it was, it's still progress, a discovery that may prove useful. The boy had a wide grin on his face after hearing the fox praise him. Even if it was shallow, praise is still praise, something Naruto rarely ever received, if at all. After several minutes passed, Naruto sheepishly spoke up. Fox. Yes, Naruto. I don't know how to get back now. The boy finished with a light, nervous laugh. The fox facepalmed with enough force to echo through the hallways. Well, that's unfortunate, isn't it? Looks like you'll have to figure that out now. Yeah, came the drawn-out reply in uncertain tone. After an hour of failed attempts to wake himself up, Naruto groaned and plopped onto the wet floor in defeat. The fox had since lain on the floor and relaxed with his head resting on his palm. Eventually he spoke up and offered lazily, "You know, maybe you should try thinking about how you got here, and then go backwards from there." Naruto blinked and looked up at the nine-tailed kitsune. "You mean retracing my steps? Like the thing people say to do when you lose something important?" The fox nodded in confirmation. The blonde folded his arms and scratched his chin. I could try. It took an additional half-hour for Naruto to finally blink and find himself back in the library where he'd originally left off. He returned just as if he were waking up from his dream visits with the fox, only to find that no time had passed at all since he'd gone into the kitsune's prison. What the heck? But I was in there for at least 2 hours. The boy said to himself in confusion. He glanced around the library, confused at first. He nearly jumped out of his skin when he saw the old geezer librarian standing next to him and glancing over his shoulder. "I say, Uzumaki, I didn't take you for the type to actually open up a book, let alone research anything. Came the old man's surprisingly lighter tone than what Naruto had been expecting. Naruto was speechless, mouth agape and eyes wide in equal parts confusion and fear, like a deer caught in a genjutsu. I most certainly didn't expect you to have interest in spiritual and supernatural energies. Quite intriguing, if you don't mind me saying so myself. How ironic that Konoha's prankster has taken up such a niche hobby. The old man said with a chuckle. Naruto stammered and struggled to find words. I'm just getting ready for the Ninja Academy. Yeah, I have less than 2 years till I'm old enough to sign up. He managed to blurt out between nervous and idiotic laughs. The old man simply blinked at the boy and smiled. You silly boy, they don't teach any of these fantasy things in the academy curriculum. Mythology and the supernatural are fun topics to enlighten oneself with, but. He then pointed off to a section in the nonfiction part of the library. If you're preparing for the academy, you'd be much better off looking into subjects over in that part of the library. We even have a starter guide in a convenient little pamphlet to give academy hopefuls a list of subjects to start with, as a matter of fact. Now Naruto was really confused. Not only was the old geezer not chasing him off the property, but he was actually helping him. The boy was unable to speak for long enough to get the old man to raise an eyebrow and ask, "Everything all right, boy? I hope you aren't planning on pulling that pocket sand stunt you did the day before, that was quite rude." Naruto shook his head and nervously managed to get out, "And no, I don't understand, why are you helping me? I thought you hated me." The librarian merely waved off that notion, resuming his usual facial expression, "Hate you? Heavens, no, boy. I may have my reservations about you due to your less than stellar reputation, but I never hated you. As for why I'm helping you, well, while I admit I'm still quite cross with you over your modern art exhibit using our library chairs, my duties as a librarian come first." He raised his hand in dignified fashion and extended his index finger as he continued. "What kind of librarian would I be if I turned away a young, inquisitive mind, No matter how much of a pest they can be, every child deserves the opportunity to learn." The librarian added the last two sentences with an air of nobility and duty. Naruto had a look on his face as if he'd woken up in an alternate reality, but nevertheless he followed the librarian as he guided him to the station that gave out Shinobi Academy starting guide pamphlets. The old man handed Naruto one of the pamphlets and said, "This will help you find everything you need to know to help prepare yourself for the academy. Let me know if you need any additional assistance." The librarian turned to go back to where he was originally working, but stopped briefly to look back and give a quick warning, "Oh, and before I forget, try not to make modern art in the library again. I may not want to prevent a young mind from obtaining knowledge, but I won't hesitate to do what I need to protect this knowledge for everyone else in Konoha, are we clear?" Naruto silently nodded his head in understanding. The blonde eventually decided to make the best of the situation and check the guide out of curiosity. "Hey, Rye Fox. Yes, annoying brat, can you do the reading for me for these ninja books?" The fox laughed for a good minute before firmly stating, "No, I'm not going to do all the reading for you. If you want to become a shinobi so badly, then you're going to have to put in some effort yourself." Naruto's attitude soured significantly after hearing that. Despite how much he hated reading, he reluctantly fought through it and looked over the list. The Academy Starter's Guide had several titles that looked way out of his league, though he decided to give them a shot anyway. He picked a random title and found it placed neatly on one of the nearby bookshelves, pulling out the book and looking over the title. "Chakra Theory for Advanced Learners. Sounds good to me, I guess." Don't you think it would be a better idea to start at, oh I dunno, the beginning of the list? Came the fox's voice with no lack of sarcasm and criticizing tone. Naruto snorted. Peef, I totally got this. Watch me, I'm gonna ace this, no problem. Naruto was lost almost immediately, both from a mix of inability to focus and his own lack of understanding. The boy would have been better off starting from the very first books on the list, but Naruto was too impatient and deemed it a good idea to hit the ground running with one of the titles further along the list. He wasn't expecting to faceplant the second he hit the ground. The fox chuckled and asked with a smug tone in his voice, so, how's it going there, Ace? Naruto, face down in the book, let out a grumble in response. Sorry, didn't quite catch that, the fox got out between amused snickering. Naruto leaned up from the book and muttered, I hate you, to which the fox immediately responded with, I know, I hate you too. An hour of fumbling later, Naruto gave up and admitted defeat. He took the kitsune's advice and grabbed the first book on the list, Understanding Chakra, a Beginner's Guide. This one, as patronizing as the title was, definitely seemed like a better fit for the boy. Despite the change in difficulty, the blonde still struggled with the reading material. I hate this. None of this makes any sense. He angrily declared. Calm down, you're learning a new concept. Here, I'll help you, if you ask nicely. The kitsune added the last part with a barely concealed smugness that the boy easily picked up on by now. Naruto let his head drop onto the table with an audible whump. Fine, Rai Fox, will you please help me read these damn books? The fox laughed at Naruto's expense, enjoying humbling the boy and getting on his nerves every opportunity he got. It was only fair, given how often the boy had done it to him. To that end, it had almost become a game between the two, a competition to see how much one could annoy the other. The fox didn't care much for it, but it was at least moderately entertaining, and he became able to gain insight to how the boy thought, which was an added bonus. It was a slow and arduous process trying to get Naruto to actually retain the knowledge that the fox had taken in from the books each day, but progress was still progress. Eventually, the fox managed to assist Naruto in at least becoming familiar with the beginner books, though he would still have difficulty recalling the information off the top of his head. Nevertheless, the fox kept to his word and assisted Naruto with reading through the many books on the list over the next several days. After each library visit, the two would retreat to the kitsune's prison and go over what the contents of each new book entailed. Inadvertently, the fox also gained valuable knowledge of his own, particularly concerning chakra. The fox sat there, watching the boy think long and hard about each day's lesson. It was clear that Naruto still had trouble grasping the concepts, and there was only so much information his mind could soak in before he started forgetting things. As much as it frustrated him to have to do so, the fox simply had to limit the amount of information he went over with Naruto per session. Sadly, even then, Naruto's problems with his attention span started interfering. The fox freely admitted to himself that he wasn't the best teacher for Naruto, that had made itself painfully obvious within the first day. It's not even that the fox desired to teach the boy at all, but Naruto's success was directly tied with the fox's chances at freedom from this accursed prison. So despite all the drawbacks and how brutally frustrating the attempts at teaching the boy were, the fox begrudgingly fought through it. So that was the way things went for the weeks that followed. Naruto would go to the library, sit down with a collection of books from the Academy Prep Guide, and the fox would read through them. Afterwards, Naruto would slip over to the fox's prison and the two would sit as the fox struggled to teach Naruto what the books contained, and Naruto would likewise struggle to learn the lessons the fox gave him. At the end of the month, Naruto had made a steady amount of progress, though not necessarily a large quantity of it. Still, the fox reminded itself, progress is progress. His thoughts were interrupted when the boy looked up uncertainly at the great kitsune and asked nervously, Rai, do you think I'm ready for the academy? The fox noted that near the end of this month-long process, the boy had gradually stopped calling him Rai Fox as often and had instead started referring to him as Rai. He didn't care what the boy chose to call him, but it felt refreshing hearing the boy use a genuine name for him without any obvious demeaning undertones. The fox hesitated briefly, not wanting to give the boy an ego, but also not wanting him to be let down too harshly. Wait, what am I saying? I don't actually care about this brat. Why am I even concerning myself with such drabble? The kitsune shook his head at Naruto and spoke with an uncaring voice, of course not, you're nowhere near ready for the academy. He of course didn't know any of this from experience, but he made the assessment based on what the books had gone over, assuming that, since they were academy prep, students needed to know the outlined basics before attending, at the very least. The kitsune's ears drooped involuntarily upon seeing the effects his brutally honest statement had on Naruto. The boy looked crushed, but the fox couldn't comprehend why. Since when did the boy give the fox's opinions such high regard? The fox immediately chastised himself, but not because he'd made the boy sad, but rather, that he'd legitimately felt bad for doing it. Am I seriously feeling bad over this little brat and his precious feelings? If the blonde idiot isn't ready for the academy, then he isn't ready. It's not my fault he can't handle the truth, despite many self-criticisms over the implications, and despite warning himself numerous times throughout this entire endeavor to not get attached to the boy due to his role in all of this. The fox found himself genuinely feeling a pang of guilt over what he'd said, albeit a small pang of guilt. Naruto has willingly helped me with all of this and more or less done everything I asked of him, without question, even though he was constantly annoying about it. He pointed out in his mind, trying to justify why he felt this way without allowing himself to believe he was concerned for Naruto in the slightest. Perhaps he didn't care for the boy, but he was a significant investment at this point, and he did prove to be a competent ally in this journey to uncover the fox's past. Maybe, just this once, he'd offer a bit of encouragement, if at least to save face and free himself of this annoying guilt. He sighed heavily and conceded that he couldn't simply leave the boy off on that note, and he begrudgingly spoke up right as the boy turned to leave. Naruto, wait. The boy stopped and looked back, the gloomy look still in his eyes that reaffirmed the pang of guilt that the fox felt in his chest. Why yeah, Rai, the fox grumbled under his breath before speaking the words, what I meant to say is, you aren't ready for the academy, yet. You still have at least another year to prepare yourself before you enroll, right? That's plenty of time to prepare yourself. Hearing this, the boy's expression showed noticeable improvement. You think I can make it by then? The kitsune took a deep breath before continuing, I do. I also need to point out that that list is just a guide to get a head start in the academy, so it's not exactly required reading. I don't think you necessarily have to know everything on that list. I don't know for sure though. That made a smile start to creep onto Naruto's face. The fox actively berated himself for letting the boy influence him like this, but, at the same time, he couldn't help but admit he felt better. The pang of guilt was gone at the very least. Naruto nodded to the fox and grinned excitedly. Don't you worry, Rai, I'll be ready when the day comes, you'll see. Before the fox could even blink, the boy vanished back to reality, leaving the fox to contemplate what had just transpired. The fox plopped onto the floor, gripping at his head and face. You idiot, you're not supposed to grow attached to the brat, he's a tool, remember? He gritted his teeth and hit the ground with his tails repeatedly in frustration. His mind went over the events leading up to this, trying to justify and reason and come up with any and all manner of excuses to allow him to claim he did not care about the boy in the slightest. He only saw Naruto as a means to an end, period. It was only after he'd come to his stubborn conclusions and borderline denial, and a long nap, that the realization hit him like a hammer over his head. He thought long and hard over the next several hours only to come upon a very unsettling revelation. An explanation as to why his words had such an effect on Naruto, an explanation for why Naruto had called him Rai, instead of Rai Fox, why Naruto continued to come back to the fox and repeatedly asked for his help, and how Naruto was always willing to help. These were all things that had troubled him from the start, but he'd yet to figure out, or even care about, until now. It was blatantly obvious in retrospect, once he put all the pieces together. Yes, of course, how could he have been so stupid and clueless before? This was something that the fox hadn't so much as considered in all of this. The fox's ears drooped and he had an expression and feeling that he couldn't describe, and he refused to acknowledge. It wasn't so much that the fox had grown attached to Naruto, which he adamantly denied, rather. Naruto had become attached to him. Well, this complicates things a bit, doesn't it? Rai said aloud after almost an hour of mixed contemplation, half-assed excuses and denial. The annoying brat isn't exactly making the whole "don't get attached" thing easy for me, is he? He mused to himself with a chuckle. To think that the annoying blonde had softened the fox's resolve was blasphemous. The boy was a means to an end, and that was that. The fox did not care about the boy, any more than an investor would care about their investment. Naruto was only worth his usefulness to the fox and the amount of time Rai had invested into their endeavors. Period. End of story. With a resigned huff, Rai turned away from that train of thought and instead focused on the lessons he'd gone over with Naruto. During their month-long session, he'd picked up on some very useful information, most notably information concerning chakra. He cleared his mind like he'd done before, reaching out to find that familiar sense of energy. Once again, the crimson smoke fire began to flow and surround the fox's body. He recalled everything he'd read in the books and scrolls on chakra theory, chakra control, and chakra's role in the lives of shinobi. So, this must be chakra then. It feels and acts in a manner very similar to what was depicted in those academy books, but I thought most forms of chakra were a shade of blue, not crimson. Odd. Rai sat there, focusing and letting his chakra flow freely. He observed the chakra, familiarizing himself on how it behaved and acted, how it responded to his thoughts and other stimulus, and briefly experimented with how to control it. He used every last bit of knowledge he'd gained from his reading, though ultimately it still fell upon him to learn how to utilize his chakra and figure things out through trial and error. It seemed to behave in a predictable enough manner, though its habit of influencing his emotions in a negative manner frustrated and annoyed him, which only made things worse the longer he let his chakra flow. The negativity and emotional turmoil felt within the chakra dissipated almost immediately when he dispersed the chakra flow and stopped focusing, as if it had never been there in the first place. This confused Rai, and pushed him to take things further, albeit with an air of caution. The observations and experimenting went on for quite some time. Rai continued to focus and call forth the chakra from within himself the same way he'd done prior. Eventually the fox tried using some of the basic hand seals he'd learned about while trying to teach Naruto according to everything he learned from the books, in addition to some residual knowledge he'd been fortunate enough to recover from his past life. Unfortunately, With no knowledge of any jutsu on hand that he could try and produce with the signs, and the fact that the book on hand signs was a basic beginner's manual, they did little more than offer him an avenue to apply focus with his chakra, depending on the signs used, and give him a glimpse into shinobi and how they operated. Most perplexing, I suppose I'll be able to learn more about this once Naruto attends that shinobi academy of his. Until then I'm not going to be able to utilize my chakra in any meaningful manner, as far as I can tell. 'Tis a shame, but there's not much more I can do on my own. He rolled his shoulders and decided to practice making the hand signs for the next couple of days, as well as becoming more comfortable with drawing out his chakra. He also put forth considerable effort in taming the negative emotions the chakra fought to infect his mind with. However, this would prove to be the most difficult aspect of his practice. At the very least, Rai now had a better understanding of chakra and the building blocks of casting ninjutsu. Additionally, he believed he had a better idea as to how the gate was locked, though he still had no idea how he would go about unlocking it, or where to even begin researching the mechanisms behind the lock. Come to think of it, nothing had really changed as far as the cage was concerned. He was still nowhere closer to unlocking that gate than he had been when he first woke up. Nevertheless, he would be able to use this basic knowledge and add on to them with lessons that the academy would be teaching to Naruto. He would learn everything he could and apply it wherever possible. Eventually he would figure out the next step to unlocking this gate, he just had to be patient. Unspecified Konoha River, afternoon. Naruto sat at the edge of the river that flowed through Konoha. His face had a mildly gloomy expression to it. He was idly chucking rocks into the water every so often and trying to skip them across its surface. It wasn't that Naruto didn't have anything else to do. If anything, he had plenty of other things he could be doing at that moment. The reason he was here, though, idly chucking rocks instead of literally anything else, was because he was desperately trying to get his mind off of the unfortunate fact that it had been 6 days since October had rolled around. The air was getting colder, the leaves were falling ever more frequently and in greater quantity as the forests fully took on the colors of autumn. The blonde-haired boy chucked one last rock into the river, it giving an anticlimactic plunk as it failed to skip and simply slipped under the surface of the water. He sighed and laid back, resting his head on his hands, and he looked up at the sky. He lay there in the grass now and watched as the leaves with their shades of orange danced overhead on their gentle journey towards the ground. Naruto typically didn't like just sitting around doing nothing, but this was at least a pleasant distraction for him to focus on and keep his mind off of the fact that it was only 3 more days until October 10th, the day of Naruto's birthday. Everyone came together and celebrated on October 10th, except they weren't celebrating Naruto's birthday. No, the villagers of Konoha were celebrating the day that the 4th Hokage fought against the multi-tailed demon that had attacked the village and nearly destroyed it on that very day. The Yondaime managed to defeat the tailed demon, but had given his life in the process. He sacrificed himself in defending this village, and was honored as a hero by everyone in Konoha on the 10th of October, some even went further and carried on well into the days following. Naruto had been told initially by Tyuki and had things further explained to him by the elderly librarian, that the event originally started as a simple gathering for the people of Konoha to mourn for the loss of the 4th Hokage. At the same time, it also allowed them the chance to rejoice for the victory against the demon, appreciate the continuation of their village and its ensured safety. Over time, as the people had moved on, the event gradually morphed into less of a ceremony and became more of a festival. The people would come together and celebrate the memory of the hero of Konoha, and celebrate his great victory over the demon that had so nearly destroyed Konohagakure. Recently, the festival became a village-wide event. People would adorn garments typical of festival events, and there would be music, games, food and drink, it all seemed like a lot of fun. Unfortunately for Naruto, when he tried to attend the year prior, the villagers gave him such accusatory looks and said no small variety of unkind and unpleasant things about him that they probably thought he couldn't hear. That was only after he'd gotten lucky enough to sneak into the main area the event was taking place, as the event coordinators made it a point to prevent him from entering without making it obvious that this was what they were doing. Naruto didn't know any of these finer details himself, of course, but he nonetheless felt unwelcome at best, and decided to simply watch the festivities from a distance. Naruto could only assume that things would be the same this year. The village had already started setting up the decorations for this year's event, and judging by how busy everyone seemed to be, this year's celebration of Oiwai no Yondaime, celebration of the fourth, as some villagers called it, was going to be just as big as last year's. Naruto wasn't looking forward to it like everyone else was, but the one thing he did look forward to on the 10th of October would be waiting for him at Ramen Ichiraku. Naruto's eyes opened with a start. He never realized that he'd even fallen asleep. A quick glance around him confirmed that he'd napped for a good hour or two, as the presence of the evening sky overhead affirmed. He hopped to his feet and brushed himself off before taking a walk, not heading anywhere in particular. He idly kicked the occasional stone as he came to it, ignoring the occasional villager he came across as he wandered. Eventually, the boy had found his way back home and decided to call it a night early. He propped himself up in his bed and opened the scroll that the elderly librarian had loaned to him, citing that there is such a thing as trying to cram too much knowledge in at once. It was an illustrated guide to handling shuriken and proper throwing techniques, something simple he could go over during his rest period. Naruto wasn't quite sure what the old man meant by it all, but apparently his brain is a muscle too or something. He remembered the old man mentioning something about working out too much being unhealthy, and that just like using regular muscles, the mind needed to rest too. I still don't know what any of that means, but whatever. Naruto hadn't paid much attention after the librarian mentioned shuriken throwing. So now he sat here on his bed, the scroll unrolled and laying in his lap. He went over the detailed illustrations and used his imagination to great effect in making sense of the pictures. Naruto could never think up something from scratch, but he was quite talented in adding things to a reference image. He imagined the shinobi in the drawings making the movements according to the arrows and directions, moving slowly with his own upper body to try and mimic what he was visualizing in his head. I think this is how they're doing it. I need to get myself a shuriken so I can test these out sometime. He'd tried to acquire a shuriken earlier, only to be turned down due to being too young to own a weapon, as the equipment vendors always told him. After going over the scroll one last time, he got out of bed and grabbed some scrap paper that he'd normally used to doodle on. Naruto folded up the piece of paper to try and get it to take the shape of a shuriken, and had moderate success in making something that looked vaguely like one. He grinned at his handiwork, satisfied with the results, and then took a stance like the one the scroll depicted. Like this, and then, he gave the paper shuriken a throw, and watched as it flailed through the air and failed to so much as go in the general direction Naruto had aimed for. His determination unshaken, he grabbed the paper construct off the ground and gave it another go, achieving very little success despite repeated attempts to replicate what he'd seen in the books. Every time he threw it, the paper shuriken simply flopped around along its trajectory and flew off in a random direction. He sighed and decided that there was no way around it. He needed a real shuriken if he expected to get anywhere with this. Naruto would figure all that out later, though there was plenty of time for that. He decided to pay Rai a visit and see what the fox was up to, sliding back into bed and focusing on an image of the fox's prison just like he'd done before. When Naruto opened his eyes, He felt the familiar coolness of the water that perpetually flooded the prison and looked up to see Rai surrounded by chakra. It kinda looked like the pictures in that one scroll he'd seen for chakra control, but this was different. It was red, like, really red. Rei's ears twitched, indicating he was aware of Naruto's presence. The big fox casually turned around as the red chakra faded, but not completely. An expectant look formed on Rei's face while he tilted his head to look at the boy. What is it, Naruto? I was in the middle of something, Rai lazily asked with a tinge of annoyance after making eye contact with the blonde. Naruto gave a light frown. You've been in the middle of something all week. I just wanted to see what you were so busy with, and to chat, you know. The fox let out a resigned sigh and proceeded to lay in a comfortably lazy position on the floor, as comfortable as he could manage at least. He rested his cheek against his hand, bracing his arm with his elbow on the floor. He spoke in a tone that was a bit cold. I suppose I could take a break and indulge in your developmental and social needs. This only made Naruto tilt his head, unsure what some of the words meant and not knowing how to respond. Rai rolled his eyes and reiterated, You wanted to talk? Fine, let's talk, brat. Naruto was confused as to why Rai was acting this way, but nevertheless proceeded to tell the fox about how he'd been trying to learn about shuriken and kunai. Since he hadn't gotten nearly far enough in learning about chakra to start training with it, unlike the fox, he wanted something he could learn here and now, something that he could easily get into and not have to spend so much time reading about. You do whatever it is you want to do, boy, you don't need my permission to start learning a new skill, the fox said in a tone that had come across a lot more irritated and condescending than he'd intended, making it visible that the conversation didn't interest him in the slightest in an effort to get Naruto to end the conversation so he could return to his chakra observations, though it failed to faze the boy even a little bit. Naruto pressed on, ignoring the fox's expression and tone. That's the thing, I can't get any real kunai or shuriken to practice with. None of the adults will let me have one because they say I'm too little to own a weapon. I was wondering if you could help me out, maybe give me some ideas of what to do. Rai couldn't help but laugh, pointing out the irony and mocking Naruto in one fell swoop. So, let me see if I'm understanding this correctly. The infamous prankster of Konoha, whose ingenuity in executing his elaborate and well-planned out pranks could put battle-hardened generals and tacticians to shame, cannot figure out how he could possibly acquire a simple shuriken because of some asinine rules. You don't have any problems managing to acquire Ryo when you need it, despite the rules imposed for that. What makes this situation so different? Even as Naruto's face started to scrunch up, the fox continued to mock him. I'm not going to steal a shuriken, you dumb fox. You know the reasons why I sometimes have to take money from people who have more than I ever will. Are you gonna help me or not? Naruto stated with an air of indignation at the thinly veiled jab at his lifestyle, folding his arms and giving Rai an angry look. Naruto had told him this and explained it all before. He only took Ryo from the rich snobs, and it was only when he absolutely needed it for things like food and other necessities. Rai knew this, and it upset Naruto to see him bring it up when he was just asking for help. The fox found this all to be very amusing. The blonde was adamant in where he stood on the issue of stealing, hypocritical as the blonde was. Rai scratched his chin with a cheeky grin on his face and then spoke in a cold tone, I don't know what you expect me to do about your petty little problem. You're on your own this time, brat. Use that creative brain of yours and think of something. Or, grow a spine and get over your moral qualms about taking what you want, I could care less. The fox snorted before he concluded with, I'm in the middle of something far more important than anything you might be dealing with, so scram. The boy looked down for a few moments, and the expression he had on his face when he looked back at the fox sent a feeling of guilt into him. The fox did his best to ignore it, but what the boy said next would add significant weight to it that he would be unable to ignore after the blonde left. "I don't understand. Why are you being such a jerk all of a sudden?" was what the boy said, but the fox didn't get the implications at the time of him saying it. In the moment, though, Rai was uncaring and continued with the same harsh tone he'd had earlier. "A jerk, am I? Maybe you shouldn't come barging in interrupting people with your pathetic issues." Rai noted that the expression on the boy's face indicated that he was clearly hurt by everything the fox said, but he'd paid the boy no mind and shook his head. After a moment, he sat up and turned to resume his exploration of chakra. It was only now that he realized he never fully dissipated the crimson chakra prior to speaking with Naruto. He also realized, with a growing dread, that the chakra had been exerting its influence on the fox the whole time, making him act in a more negative and malicious manner than he would have under ordinary circumstances. Unfortunately for the fox, Naruto had already left by the time the realizations hit him. He'd been unnecessarily critical, cold, and almost cruel towards the boy, and he hadn't even noticed it at the time. He may not like the boy, but he certainly didn't harbor any of the ill will towards him that this chakra had been subtly filling Rei's head with. "Damn it," was the only thing the fox thought of to say as the gravity of the situation hit him and added immense weight to the guilt he'd felt earlier. This situation, as it was, could be repaired with a little bit of time and effort. That wasn't such a big deal. It would simply entail Rai forcing himself to apologize to the kid and coming up with some fancy words to downplay his actions earlier, maybe come up with a solution to his shuriken situation as an olive branch to smooth things over, take things a step further and give an active role in it if need be, and that'd be the end of it. What truly troubled the fox, however, were the scenarios playing out in his head about how much worse the situation could have very easily been. The thoughts cropping up by the emotional influence the chakra had on him were becoming steadily more malicious in nature, some of them were unforgivably cruel. As much as Rai convinced himself he didn't care about the child, he also had to acknowledge that he had never felt any sense of malice towards the brat either. Had the conversation gone on for much longer and the negative influence of the crimson chakra had really taken hold, he shuddered to imagine how it would have affected Naruto. He admitted that he enjoyed pushing the brat's buttons and getting a rise out of him. It was entertaining to see his reactions. The things that this red chakra convinced him of though, those went too far. They were spiteful, hateful, irrationally negative in every aspect. The fox could feel himself somehow relating to them to an extent, but to have these thoughts aimed towards Naruto, it was irrational and illogical. Naruto was annoying, yes, but Naruto has also been helpful. Rai at least had a modicum of gratitude towards the boy, enough so that he greatly disapproved of the kinds of things this chakra made him think about the child. He could have very easily and inadvertently destroyed the fragile bond that the boy was beginning to form with him, as one-sided as it was. If that had happened, Rai would be stuck here in this cage, back to square one and with a high probability that he wouldn't find anyone else anytime soon and that Naruto would cease in his willingness to be helpful. All that time and effort, gone, all because of the fox's carelessness in handling this newfound energy of his and not being more aware of its influence. He chastised himself vigorously and replayed in his mind everything he'd said to the boy. He went over the conversation several times in his head, trying to identify any noticeable differences in his thought process to try and gauge how much the chakra affected him and any discernible points where it increased its influence. Rai would be prepared next time, partly out of pride and principle, partly out of concern for losing the only help he had available to him. With a determined huff, Rai endeavored to be more cautious from now on. He would pay closer attention to his emotional state and make certain that the crimson chakra wasn't influencing him when he spoke with the boy. The fewer opportunities that this foreign influence had to meddle in his interactions with Naruto, the better. Naruto had his usefulness and had a great deal of potential for expanding that usefulness in the future. Rai was not about to lose that, especially not from something he'd done inadvertently. First things first, he thought to himself, damage control. I need to make it up to the boy, and mend whatever damage I unintentionally caused. He sighed, hating the fact that he'd have to pretend to care about the brat and play the part of a remorseful fox. Rai may have truthfully been remorseful for how he'd acted earlier, but nobody else had to know that, right? Naruto's apartment, late morning. Naruto woke the next morning after a restless sleep. He couldn't understand it. The fox wasn't exactly a nice guy, but he never acted like such a huge jerk before. He treated Naruto in a similar fashion to how some of the more unkind villagers did, and he couldn't wrap his mind around why. Had he said something that upset Rai? Had he forgotten to do something the fox asked him to do? Naruto thought long and hard, but ultimately came up with nothing that could explain the fox's unusual behavior the night before. He decided he'd ask Tuki about it later and see if the ramen chef had any useful insight. He may as well, since he'd be going there at around lunchtime anyway, same as always. Tuki was at least somewhat helpful in the matter, as it turned out. The ramen chef had initially misunderstood what Naruto was trying to ask and came to the conclusion that the boy was talking about an imaginary friend of sorts. Naruto having an imaginary friend wasn't too much of a stretch for the ramen chef to guess at, given how lonely the poor boy was. Your friend Rai sounds like something is deeply troubling him. Maybe you should give him some space for a while and let him sort it out on his own. Tuki was multitasking between cleaning the day's lunch dishes and doing his best to give his advice to Naruto. I've seen folks get upset over something completely unrelated to their friends and inadvertently take it out on them without even realizing it. Might be the case with Rai. Naruto shrugged, it was as good an explanation as any. He slurped up the last of his lunch as Tuki continued. I'm sorry I can't offer much more in advice, Naruto-kun, but I don't know a whole lot about kitsunes. Ramen is my specialty, not imaginary friend counseling, unfortunately. Maybe you could head over to one of the playgrounds or parks, see if any of the other children have imaginary friends of their own. Might give you a leg up towards making real-world friends, don't you think? Having something you can relate to often helps people connect better. The ramen chef meant well and was just trying to help the boy, but Naruto knew, and Tuki to an extent also knew this, from experience that there wasn't any point of the boy trying to make friends with any of the other kids. Every time he tried to reach out and form any sort of bond with the other children, either they would reject him out of the fear their parents instilled in them about the demon child that held a terrible spirit within them, or their parents would directly intervene and whisk them away, scolding them all the while. Naruto would try again anyway on occasion, mostly due to his innate stubbornness, only to be met with the same results every time. He refused to give up in the hopes that eventually he'd get through and make a friend, but at this moment he simply didn't feel like giving it another try. Naruto thanked the chef for his advice and the meal, but he decided to pass on trying to socialize with the other kids, at least for now. He paid for his meal and headed off, waving to Tuki before he rounded the corner. From a point of observation nearby, same time, two masked figures watched the blonde leave from their hidden positions, one having the mask of a cat, the other having the mask of a fox. They glanced to one another and proceeded to communicate via hand signs, so it's confirmed, big orange bastard is stirring, cat signed with a tilt of her head. Fox shook his head and replied with, negative, can't confirm, not yet. Need to continue observing, make absolutely sure. The two leapt from their hiding spot and swiftly moved to a new viewpoint, one of the duo keeping their eyes on the blonde-haired boy at all times. Cat spoke in a volume lower than a whisper, should we inform the Sandaime anyway? Just in case. And this time Fox gave a quick nod of his head in affirmation. He kept his attention focused on Naruto and everything immediately around the boy, answering in an equally quiet tone, "Might be for the best, yeah." Kat gave a nod and turned as if to leave, but glanced back and whispered, "Wait, whose turn is it this time to be messenger?" Fox glared at his partner and gave a gesture as if saying, "Really?" Kat sheepishly held her hands up in a defensive gesture before turning back and swiftly took off. She leapt across the rooftops at such a speed that any ordinary citizen would never see them. Fox remained, keeping his gaze affixed on the blonde-haired boy and maneuvering as needed to always keep him in his sight. The Hokage's office. Minutes later. Kat entered into the Hokage's office through the concealed entrance reserved for Anbu, silent and without a single soul witnessing her. The Sandaime was seated at his desk and shuffling through a small stack of paperwork when Kat stood before him. She bowed in respect to the leader of Konoha and waited to be addressed, though she didn't have to wait more than a few seconds before she heard him speak. "Report," he stated in a neutral tone, not looking up from his paperwork for the time being, instead choosing to multitask. The mask that Kat wore distorted her voice as she spoke. "We have reason to believe that Naruto has made contact with the Kyuubi no," though Kat hadn't the time to finish. The Sandaime immediately looked directly at Kat with a deeply disturbed expression and said, "How certain are you of this?" Before Kat continued, the Hokage held a hand up while his other hand moved to the corner of his desk, and Kat nodded in agreement. He pressed his hand to the corner and activated a seal. A moment later, a multi-stage barrier surrounded his office to prevent anyone outside from being able to see or hear anything inside the barrier. Once the privacy seal applied itself completely, he motioned for Kat to continue. Fox believes it is too soon to confirm 100%, but the evidence is clear enough for us to have to acknowledge that, in all likelihood, Naruto Uzumaki has made contact with, and is actively speaking to, the Kyuubi no Kitsune. Hearing this made the Sandaime's face pale. He slowly stood up from his desk, pipe in hand, and walked over to the window to gaze out upon Konohagakure. He brought the mouthpiece of the pipe to his lips and inhaled deeply as he took in the gravity of this situation. The Sandaime, keeping his gaze upon the view of the village before him, soon spoke again. "For how long can you safely assume that this has been going on?" he asked, taking another puff from his pipe. "The earliest we can confirm, based on when Naruto began showing signs he was actively speaking to the Kyuubi, is in mid to late August of this year. There is evidence that it may have contacted Naruto earlier, judging by the child's behavioral patterns over the month prior, but we have no way of confirming this for certain." "I see," the man finally said with an audible sigh. He dreaded the next question he had to ask, but he had to know, for the sake of the safety of Konohagakure. He took another puff from his pipe, and then took a deep breath before finally asking, "Do you have reason to believe that the beast is manipulating Naruto? Is there any implication that Naruto is under the Kyuubi's influence at all?" Kat hesitated at first. "It's complicated, Lord Third." The Sandaime turned his head to look at Kat, a hopeful, yet cautious expression on his face. "How so?" Fox is under the impression that Naruto is still very much himself, as of this moment. There is no verifiable evidence that the beast is manipulating the child. However, we can confirm that the beast is having some manner of influence on the boy, though it's been largely non-malevolent as far as we can tell. The elderly Hokage scratched his chin, thinking this information over with his brow furrowed. He emptied the smoldering remains within the pipe into a wastebin next to his desk, then took out another batch of ground tobacco and gingerly set it into his pipe and lit it. The Sandaime lightly smacked his lips against the mouthpiece of the pipe, letting out little tufts of smoke in the process, before he spoke again. "Could you elaborate for me?" Konoha Market, early afternoon. Naruto eyed the weapons vendor's storefront, taking it in and trying to apply himself like he normally would if he were trying to carry out one of his elaborate pranks. I can do this, I just have to focus. Imagine that I'm just pranking this guy by having him think one of his shuriken and kunai was stolen. Naruto's expression soured as the last line reminded him what he was really doing. Stupid fox, I don't want to just take this guy's stuff. The blonde sighed and tried to take his mind off of it by focusing on all the awesome stuff he'd be able to do once he had his own shuriken and kunai. The fact that just owning a shuriken and kunai would make him that much cooler, and possibly win him the envy of some of the other kids, maybe even convince them to get to know him better and be friends. Well, if at least for the sake of being able to play with a real ninja tool. The boy gulped and made a plan in his head, working over the details as he would a prank. I just need a good distraction. I can sneak in behind a shopper, then hide until the shopkeeper is distracted by the customer, then I make my move. I pocket the kunai and the shuriken, then slip out before he can chase after me. If he spots me, I can just outrun him or hide. He looks like he couldn't catch me if his life depended on it. He took some deep breaths, then hid in wait for his opportunity. Eventually, his patience no small feat paid off and he managed to slip in behind a customer, hiding just out of sight of the shopkeeper. He meandered his way over to where a few shuriken and other ninja tools were on display, keeping his eyes peeled in case the shopkeeper noticed him. He watched and waited, his breathing and heart rate increasing with the tension. He nearly broke his concealment and ruined this entire endeavor when the kitsune suddenly decided now was the best time to speak to him and he'd had to suppress a startled yelp. Naruto, we need to talk. In an angry whisper, Naruto bit back, shut up, Rai Fox. I'm a little busy here. Rai resisted the urge to snap at the child, instead going for a gentler reply to avoid risking damaging his standing with Naruto any more than had already been done. Naruto, this is serious, it cannot wait. Naruto sighed and continued to whisper, okay, okay. Fine. Just hurry up. The boy kept his eyes glancing over to wait for the shopkeeper to have his attention drawn by the customer, and he spotted his opportunity before long. He swiftly went over to the display stands for the kunai and shuriken, reaching out to pocket them as he had learned to do with miscellaneous items before as part of his elaborate pranks. I wanted to apologize for my behavior earlier. The kitsune suddenly apologizing like this had caused Naruto to stop for a brief moment, nothing more than a second or two at most, but it was more than long enough with his hand extended for anyone who wasn't blind or oblivious to have taken notice. He heard the definitive shout of outrage that snapped him back into the moment. He nabbed the kunai, missed the shuriken, and bolted for the door. He'd barely taken more than 2 steps outside the doorway when he felt his legs fly forward from underneath him and one of his hands being yanked backward, the momentum making him go horizontal for a brief moment before gravity brought him crashing into the ground with a thud. Naruto had been so focused on the shopkeeper that he'd completely missed the Chunin walking up to the storefront. Said Chunin now had firm hold of Naruto's arm and was looking down at him with a curious expression that hid his disapproval. Really, kid, you decided to just steal a kunai while I was standing right outside the store. Naruto was reeling between shock and horror. Not only had he been caught stealing, but he'd been caught stealing a weapon. The thought of what would happen if he'd gotten caught had never even crossed his mind. This was bad, really bad. He could only stammer and stutter as he tried to find the words to say, but couldn't think of any possible excuse that could get him out of this. Plus, this was a Chunin, an experienced ninja. And he'd been caught legitimately stealing. Even if Naruto could get free and make a run for it, there was no way he could outrun the law. He was done for. They'd probably expel him from the village, or worse. The Chunin confiscated the stolen kunai and handed it back to the exceptionally cross shopkeeper, who thanked the Chunin for his reaction time and successfully stopping the thief. A minor reward was offered to the Chunin as thanks, half of what the kunai was worth as payment. The Chunin gave a humble response and returned his focus to Naruto, whom he still had a very good hold of. "Alright kid, do you have anything to say for yourself?" he demanded, still keeping the disapproval from showing, though Naruto could still feel it. Even the villagers nearby were looking at him now, all of them giving scornful looks. I was just, I mean, I, was all the terrified boy had managed to get out. Unbeknownst to Naruto, Rai was kicking himself for his own stupidity and terrible timing. Damn it, I just made it worse. How did I manage to make things worse? He bit out with self-vitriolic venom, following close behind with a very colorful selection of all manner of swear words and made-up gibberish when the swears just didn't cut it, all directed at himself of course. For the first time in a long while, he screamed and raged about in his cage, slamming his tails into the walls and ramming the gate repeatedly. He would go on in this maelstrom of tails and claws and fangs until he'd sustained enough self-inflicted injury and had expended enough energy that he was forced to stop. Naruto was doing his level best to not break down and cry, the stress of the situation becoming too much for the 6-year-old to handle. The Chunin felt a twinge of sympathy for the boy and leaned down to say, "Hey, look, kid, why don't you just come clean and admit why you wanted that kunai so badly that you felt you had to steal it, huh? Is it 'cause you just couldn't wait for the academy? That's probably it, isn't it? Just be honest, you can tell me." As well-intentioned as the Chunin was, he wouldn't be able to go any further with his efforts. An Anbu wearing a fox mask had appeared before the two of them, wasting no time in stepping forth and crouching in front of the petrified boy to meet him at eye level. The fox-masked Anbu's voice was distorted as he spoke. "Naruto Uzumaki, the Hokage wishes to speak to you, immediately. Please come with me." This pushed Naruto over the edge and he let the tears fall, his eyes wide with horror and mouth ajar. Now the Hokage himself had to speak with him. He really messed up this time. There was no way he was getting out of this, he was a goner for sure. The Chunin recoiled for a moment. Whoa, wait a minute, all the kid did was steal a cheap kunai from a display stand. It can't be that serious of a crime that the Hokage himself has to step in, right? The fox-masked Anbu merely shook his head and stated, "That has no standing on why the Hokage wishes to speak with Naruto-san. Now, I will repeat myself only this once. Naruto Uzumaki, the Sandaime Hokage wishes to speak with you, immediately. I ask that you come with me, now." The Chunin released Naruto's arm at the request of the Anbu. "You better go with him, kid." Naruto dried his tears as best he could and struggled to tone down the borderline hysterics he'd come close to displaying as he stood up. At least the Hokage wasn't upset with him over his disastrous attempt at stealing the ninja tools like he'd initially panicked. That made him feel a little bit better, but that still left an uncomfortable feeling in his gut. Just what did the Hokage want to see him for that was important enough that he'd have a live Anbu come to retrieve him? It couldn't be anything good, that was for sure.